All right, good morning, everyone. All here and also those online. I'm going to make just a few announcements here. We're doing things a little different this morning. John Morissette is joining us online, and Dan is obviously here. Dan will be going over rules 6 and 7, and then we'll take a short little break, and then John will be doing 8, 9, and 10 remotely. As always, just save our questions till the end of the rule. Again, save questions to the end of the rule, and then online, just type your questions in the chat. John is going to start off with our little discrepancy we had on rule 4, little clarification, or sorry, Dan is on the little clarification we had on rule 4 of last week. So I will turn it over to Dan.
This is a follow-up on the issue that was raised when we did question 4. The issue had to do with John and I starting a hole. Just before we start, I take John's driver from the range, I put it in my bag. So I tee off, I start with 15 clubs. The question is, when John discovers that his driver is missing, can he get it back? The key is when he discovers it. If John discovers that he doesn't have his driver before he starts the round, which would most likely be the case because he's looking for it on the first hole, then there is no restriction. John can get his driver back. However, if the club, instead of being a driver, had been a wedge, let's say, I tee off with 15 clubs, John tees off with 13 clubs, he gets to the first hole, and then he says, where's my wedge? And I say, oh, John, I got it in my bag. In that case, I get the penalty for having 15 clubs, and John is prohibited or restricted in what clubs he can add. That's rule 4.1b, I think it's number 4, that restricts it to he can't use a club that someone has used on the course. So in that case, John could not get his club back. John Morissette, are you on the line?
Yes, I am, Dan.
Do you agree with that? Did you hear that?
Yeah. The bottom line is, yes, since I had not yet started my round, I could get my club back. That was the key. If I had started my round, then I could not get my club back from you.
Okay, so we agree on that point. Thanks, John. Now we'll move on to 6.
And the other fact in that scenario, though, wouldn't it be a penalty, 2-stroke penalty for Dan, who started with 15 clubs because he didn't discover it until after he got down to the hole?
Well, if I start with 15 clubs, I'm going to get the penalty no matter when I discover it. The key is that I have started with 15 clubs.
Right, because you didn't declare it out of play before you started.
Good morning, everybody. This is the second rules session, and we're going to be doing rules 6 and 7. At least I will be doing 6 and 7, and then John Morissette will be doing 8, 9, and 10. So let's start with rule 6. Let's look at the purpose statement. Rule 6.1, playing a hole. Rule 6 covers how to play a hole, such as the specific rules for teeing off to start a hole, the requirement to use the same ball for the entire hole, except when substitution is allowed. We'll be talking about the order of play, and then how to complete a hole. 6.1, when hole starts. A player has started a hole when they make a stroke to begin the hole. The hole is started even if the stroke was made from outside the teeing area or the stroke was canceled. Why is this important? It's important to know when the hole starts for a number of reasons. One of we just went over in rule 4 is if the round has started, then you'll be restricted on the clubs that you can add. So it's important to know when the round starts. Ball must be played from inside the teeing area. Player must start each hole by playing a ball from anywhere inside the teeing area. If a player who starts a hole plays a ball from outside the teeing area, including a wrong set of tee markers, you can't do that. So we're going to go through this, what happens in both match play and stroke play. We're going to go over teeing areas in just a minute, but notice that we are talking about the teeing area. So if you have a black set of tees and a white set of tees and a red set of tees, and you're playing from the white, the only teeing area we're talking about is the one you're playing from, and that is the white in my example. So in match play, there is no penalty, but the opponent may cancel the stroke. This must be done promptly and before either player makes another stroke. When the opponent cancels the stroke, they cannot withdraw the cancellation. So the player doesn't have the option when you've played out of turn or played from outside to see how the ball comes to rest or where it comes to rest, and then decide, and then you play, and then you decide whether you're going to cancel it. You have to cancel it before you make your next stroke. If the opponent does not cancel the stroke counts, and the ball is played and must be played as it lies. Stroke play. Player gets the general penalty and must correct the mistake by playing a ball from inside the teeing area. The ball played from outside the teeing area is not in play. We're going to be spending a good deal of time this morning on the difference between a ball that's in play and a wrong ball. But the strokes and any more strokes before the mistake is corrected from playing outside the teeing area and strokes solely from playing that ball do not count. If the player does not correct the mistake, he's disqualified. So this is the second of 5 must corrects in the rules. And by must correct, that means if you don't correct it in time, you are disqualified. Let's look at the teeing area rules. Ball played from teeing area. And again, the concept is teeing area means, let's look at that definition, 362. The area the player must play from in starting the hole, they are playing, the teeing area is a rectangle that is 2 club lengths deep, where the front edge is defined by the lines, the line between the forwardmost points of the 2 tee markers set by the committee, and the side edges are defined by the lines back from the outside point of the tee markers. The tee area is one of the 5 areas of the course, and as we just discussed, all other teeing areas on the course, red tees, black tees, if you're not playing those, are considered the general area. So if you look at, back to the rule, if you look at page 88, the diagram, this comes up all the time on the national exam. The committee does not set the width and the length of the tee markers. The committee only sets the width of the tee markers. So in that example, the diagram, page 88, the committee sets those 2 black markers. And then once they have set them, the rest of the teeing area is dictated by the 2 club lengths behind and the outside edge, which is the black dotted line. The ball's in the teeing area anytime the ball is touching that black dotted line. Of course, on the course, you don't have a black dotted line. You just have to imagine it. The teeing area, 6.28. The player is starting the hole from, the player will play again from the teeing area, or the player's ball is in play in the teeing area after a stroke. The teeing area rules apply in all of those situations. The way to remember that is if your ball is in the teeing area, no matter why it's there, the teeing area rules apply. And as we go through this, you'll see that the teeing area rules are very generous in what they allow you to do. Few penalties, a lot of benefits compared to the rest of the course. Teeing area rules, there are 6 of them. And again, always are going to apply whenever your ball is in the teeing area or you're going to go back and play from it. The ball is in the teeing area when any part of the ball touches or is above any part of the teeing area. So a question, you hit your tee shot, the ball hits a tree, comes back into the teeing area, and the ball is 10 feet off the ground, hanging in a tree that's overhanging the teeing area. Is the ball in the teeing area? Yes. The teeing area rules apply? Yes. So we're going to see that in that situation, you're actually going to be able to tee another ball. You don't even have to get that one. Player may stand outside the teeing area and making a stroke. Second, teeing area, number 2, ball may be teed or played from the ground. The ball must be played from either a tee placed on the ground or the ground itself. For purposes of the rule, the ground includes sand and other materials, so you can bunch up sand, if you will, and you can actually put a tee into it if you like. The penalty for this is interesting because it applies the first time you use a non-conforming tee, you're going to get a you're going to get a general penalty, and the second time you're going to be disqualified. So let's look at the definition of tee 362. Simple definition: an object used to raise a ball above the ground to play it from the teeing area. It must be no longer than 4 inches, and it must conform with the equipment rules. Anytime you see something that says it must conform with the equipment rules, your first thought is, well, how am I going to figure that out? The easy answer to this is the WSGA app on the phone is wonderful. You click on the rules, and then right underneath it, it'll say equipment rules. You click on it, equipment rules, there's a nice index, and it will tell you that how a tee has to conform. So if you're not 100% sure, you look that up. One of the requirements of a tee, it must be a device designed to raise the ball off the ground. So a question such as, can you use a Coke can for a tee? The answer is no, because a Coke can is not designed to raise a ball off the tee, and it's probably more than 4 inches. All right, teeing area rule number 3. Certain conditions in teeing area may be improved. You just have to realize that the teeing area is a special place and they allow you to do stuff. Don't analyze it beyond that. So what can you do in the teeing area? You can alter the surface of the ground in the teeing area, such as making indentations with the club or a foot. You can move, bend, or break weeds, natural objects that are attached or growing in the ground in the teeing area. The key there is in the teeing area. So if you go to swing and your club is going to hit a branch behind the teeing area, that branch that you hit, if it's not overhanging the edge of the teeing area, that is not, quote, in the teeing area, and you cannot break it. John will talk about this in Rule 8, but that would be an example of changing or improving the conditions affecting the stroke, for which you would get a penalty. You can remove pressed down sand and soil, and you can remove dew, frost, and water in the teeing area. Notice this is markedly different than a putting green. On the putting green, if you tap down frost or dew, you're going to get a penalty. We'll see that in Rule 13. Here in the teeing area, you're actually allowed to do it. Restrictions on moving tee markers or tee markers missing. A location of the tee markers is set by the committee to define each hole, and the word should alert you to the fact that you're not going to get a penalty unless we go further, but should remain in the same location. If the player improves the conditions affecting the stroke by moving any such tee marker before making a stroke from the teeing area, they get the general penalty, not for breaching this rule, but for breaching 8.1 that John is going to go over. An example of that would be you want to be on the very left side of the tee markers because you have a hook or whatever reason, and you take your stance, your foot is right up against the tee marker, so you bend down, you take the tee marker, you set it aside. Have you improved the conditions affecting the stroke? Yes, you have improved your area of intended stance, perhaps other ones as well, and so you're going to get a penalty. If the player finds one or more of the tee markers missing, the player should seek help from the committee. And this is new rules for this year. But if the committee is not available in a reasonable time, the player should use their reasonable judgment to estimate the location of the teeing area. It's almost not 100% of the time, but in most of the WSGA events, the tournament directors, Jeff or Thomas or Drew, usually put a white dot or something, and you may get there and you'll see that there are white tee markers for this group, and then there are black tee markers or red tee markers for another group. One of the tee markers may be missing. As long as you use your reasonable judgment to find out where the other tee marker was and you play from that area, you're not going to get a penalty from playing outside the teeing area.
Dan, in your example, can that player who moved the tee marker escape penalty by putting it back before he makes a stroke?
The question is, can the player who has moved a tee marker escape penalty by putting it back? The answer is going to depend on whether they come within Rule 8.1C, which John is going to go over. The short answer is yes, they'll be able to. It says, in all other situations, the tee markers are treated as regular movable obstructions. What does it mean by all other? That means other than the time that you are playing your ball from the teeing area. So as an example, you hit your ball, it hits a tree, it comes to rest 5 feet behind the teeing area. Those tee markers are considered movable obstructions. You can go up and you can move it, even though it would improve your area of intended stance or swing or line of play. And the reason you can do that is because movable obstructions are not part of Rule 8.1, which John will go over. Fifth teeing area rule. Ball is not in play until stroke is made. Whether the ball is teed or on the ground when starting a hole or playing again from the teeing area under a rule, the ball is not in play until the player makes a stroke at it, and the ball may be lifted or moved without penalty before the stroke is made. If a teed ball falls off the tee or is knocked off the tee by the player, it may be reteed, and then but if the player makes a stroke of the ball while it's falling or after it has fallen off, there's no penalty, and the stroke counts and the ball is in play. So the key here is that the ball is not in play until a stroke is made. That has implications for a number of things. One of the questions on the national exam always has to do with when you are taking relief, you have a possible lost ball, you're within the 2-3 minutes, you go back, you drop a ball. Once you drop a ball, it's going to be in play, and you're going to get, you can't play the found ball, but if it's in the penalty area, you're going to be allowed to play it without penalty. Let's look at 6. When ball in play lies in teeing area. If the player's ball in play is in the teeing area after a stroke or after taking relief, and notice what appears to be a contradiction between 5 and 6. 5 says the ball's not in play until a stroke is made. 6 is telling you your ball can be in play in the teeing area. How is that possible? Well, the example I gave is that you whiff, or you swing and it hits a tree and it comes back. This is saying that if it's in play in the teeing area, nevertheless, you can lift or move the ball without penalty, or you can play that ball or another ball from anywhere in the teeing area on a tee or the ground and so forth. In other words, when your ball is either in the teeing area or you have to play from the teeing area, remember, don't analyze it too much. Just remember that you're in the teeing area and the teeing area rule applies. What's the teeing area rule? You can do darn near anything in there, and you can use a different ball, you can tee it, and on you go. All right, 6.3, ball used in play of hole. This is one of the most difficult concepts for most people to understand when learning the rules of golf. This has to do with wrong ball in play. And to start this discussion on Rule 6.3, let me give you the question. Over the weekend, a rules official sent me the following question. it's unbelievably germane to what we're talking about. So I'm going to read the question. We're going to go through 6.3. When we get done, we're going to come back and visit this question. Simple question. In stroke play, a player tees off from the teeing area and hits his ball out of bounds. He substitutes another ball with the intent for that ball to be played under penalty of stroke and distance. But instead of teeing the ball in the teeing area, he tees the substituted ball several inches in front of the tee markers. He plays out the hole with the substituted ball, tees off on the next hole. Is the player disqualified? If he's not disqualified, does he get a penalty? And if he gets a penalty, what kind of penalty does it get? We'll come back to that as soon as we finish 6.3. If I forget to go over that, let me know and we'll go over it. All right, purpose statement 6.3. The hole is played as a progression of strokes made from the teeing area to the putting green and into the hole. After teeing off, the player is normally required to play the same ball until the hole is completed. The player gets a penalty for making a stroke at a wrong ball or a substituted ball when substitution is not allowed. The key to understanding 6.3, and what's interesting is it's only 3 pages long, but the definitions that we're going to go over are even longer, and the definitions are the key to understanding how 6.3 works. First one I want to go over is the definition of in play. In play, definition 338. In play, the status of the player's ball when it lies on the course and it is being used in the play of the hole. A ball first becomes in play on a hole when the player makes a stroke at it from inside the teeing area, or in match play when the player makes a stroke at it from outside the teeing area and the opponent doesn't cancel it. Second bullet point, the ball remains in play until it is holed, except that it's no longer in play when one of 4 things happen. And you got to know these 4 things. When the ball is lifted, when the ball is lost, when the ball is out of bounds, or when another ball has been substituted for it, even if not allowed. Does that mean that if your ball is on the putting green and you mark your ball, you lift it to clean it, that ball is no longer in play? That's correct. You've lifted it from the course. It's no longer in play. And we're going to see in just a minute when we go over the definition of wrong ball, that that's a wrong ball. So you have a wrong ball in your hand. But we're going to see in a minute the mechanism for getting it back. We all know about it. That's you replace the ball on the spot. But if you lift it, it's out of play. Secondly, when the ball is lost. The concept of a loss means you haven't found it within 3 minutes. So if in 3.5 minutes you find your ball on the course, that is not a ball in play. And we're going to see in a minute that by definition it's a wrong ball and that you can't score with it. Third, if you hit your ball out of bounds, that ball is not in play. And fourth, when another ball has been substituted for it, even if not allowed. So you're in the middle of the fairway, your ball's sitting there, you substitute another ball, whatever reason, if you intend that ball to be in play, that original ball is out of play. All right, next sentence. A ball that is not in play is a wrong ball. We're going to go over the definition of wrong ball in just a minute. What you should get out of this is that they are 180 degrees opposite. If the ball's in play, it's not a wrong ball. If the ball's a wrong ball, it's not a ball in play. We're going to see a couple of minor exceptions, but that's the thought process you should go through. A player cannot have more than 1 ball in play at the same time. Question, do you always have 1 ball in play? No, a lot of times you don't. Anytime you lift the ball, you have no ball in play. If you hit it out of bounds, you don't have a ball in play. If you lose a ball, you don't have it in play. A player cannot have more than 1 ball in play. see Rule 6.3D for the limited cases where a player may play more than one ball. We all know this. That's the provisional ball, and that's playing two balls in stroke play. When the rules refer to a ball at rest in motion, this means a ball that is in play. So in other words, when John goes over Rule 8 and Rule 9 dealing with Rule 9 dealing with the ball that is moved, we're talking about a ball that's in play. Rule 11, there are situations where a ball is deflected. We're talking about a ball in play. We're not talking about a ball that's not in play. When the ball marker is in place to mark the spot of the ball, if the ball has not been lifted, it's still in play. And if the ball has been lifted and replaced, it is in play even if the ball marker has not been removed. So notice that the ball marker has absolutely no effect on the question of whether the ball is in play or whether it's a wrong ball. The ball marker is just a tool or a device that allows you to lift your ball without getting a penalty, but it doesn't change the status of the ball from a ball that's in play to a ball that's out of play. All right, so that's in play. So what's the opposite of that? Let's look at wrong ball. It's page 363. Any ball other than the player's ball in play. Interesting, isn't it? And then we have provisional ball or second ball in stroke play. The way to think of the provisional ball and the second ball, the way I think of them is, if you have a religious bent, I think of them as purgatory balls. There are balls that they hope someday to become in play, but they ain't there yet, and they may never get there. But they're not in play, they're not the wrong ball. Those two exceptions are just purgatory balls. Examples of wrong balls: another player's ball in play, a stray ball, and the last one on the bottom of that page, the player's own ball when it is out of bounds, lost, lifted, not yet in play, or, and I would add here, or has been substituted for. Notice that those are the same four conditions that you get in the definition of when a ball is no longer in play: when it's lifted, lost, out of bounds, or substituted for. All right, next definition I want to go over is substituted. That's 362. Substitute. To change the ball the player is using to play a hole by having another ball become the ball in play. The original ball then becomes what? A wrong ball, because you've substituted for to put a ball in play. You can't have two balls in play at the same time. Another ball has been substituted when that ball has been put in play in any way, see Rule 14.4, to take the place of the original ball, whether the original ball was in play or no longer in play because it had been lifted or was lost or out of bounds. Again, you see that repetition of those things. A substituted ball is the player's ball in play, even if it was replaced, dropped, or placed in a wrong place, a wrong way, a wrong place, or the player was required under a rule to put the original ball back. In other words, if you substitute a ball for the original ball, it doesn't make any difference whether you get it right or wrong. It's now the ball in play, which means you can score with that ball, but you may get penalties. Improper substitution, playing from a wrong place, and so forth. One of the nice things about the new rules, the 2019 rules, is that they continually have cross-references throughout the rules. I encourage you, when you read a rule and there's a cross-reference, that you look at the cross-reference. So let's look at the cross-reference, which is 14.4. And it's on page 190. We just went over the definition of substitute. Here's the rule, and you should see the parallel between that and the definition of substitute and in play. When a player's ball in play is lifted from the course or is lost or out of bounds, the ball is no longer in play. The player has a ball in play again only when the player plays the original ball or another ball from the teeing area. That's rule 6.1. We just went over that. Or the original ball or another ball is replaced, dropped, or placed on the course with the intent for that ball to be in play. What's another word for the original ball or another ball being replaced, dropped, or placed on the course with the intent for the ball to be in play? Substitute. All right. If the ball is returned to the course in any way with the intent for it to be in play, the ball is in play, even if it was substituted for the original ball when not allowed, or it was replaced, dropped, or placed in a wrong place or wrong way, or by using a procedure that didn't apply. So again, when you substitute a ball and you get it wrong, that substituted ball is the ball in play, and you're going to go on to get a score for the hole. You may be adding penalty strokes because you did it in the wrong way, you substituted when you shouldn't have, you dropped it in the wrong place, and we'll see those when we get to Rule 14. All right, those are the definitions. Let's go back to 6.3. And again, the rule itself is only 3 pages long. A player may play any conforming ball when starting a hole from the teeing area and may change balls between holes. So we all know that. Once you finish a hole, if you no longer like your Titleist 4, you can throw it in the water. Pros do that all the time because they get them for free. And then they get a new ball when they start the next hole. Player must hole out with the same ball played from the teeing area, except, suppose we're going to see those 4 again. That ball is lost, comes to rest out of bounds. The player substitutes another ball when not allowed, or you can understand that the word lifted is in there, and a lifted ball can't be used to hole out unless it somehow gets its way back onto the course. The way it gets its way back onto the course is by the concept of substitution. Player should put an identifying mark on the ball. We all know that. All right, 6.3b. Substitution of another ball while playing a hole. When player is allowed and not allowed to substitute, we have 3 rules. 2 of them allow substitution. Let's go over those. Allowed to take relief. When allowed to substitute. When taking relief under a rule. That statement means anytime you take relief, whether it's free relief or penalty relief, you can substitute a ball. So it goes on to say, including when either dropping a ball or placing a ball, such as when a ball will not stay in the relief area, or when taking relief on the putting green, the player may use either the original ball or another ball. Notice again the cross-reference to 14.3a. We're going to see that next week, and when we go over that, you'll see that each time you drop or place a ball, you can use a new ball. Second time you can use a substituted ball. When playing again from the previous stroke, from where the previous stroke was made. So why do you do that? Hit your ball out of bounds, you hit it into a penalty area, the ball is unplayable. And there's also cases in which you have to play from the previous stroke because the stroke was canceled. We're going to go over that in match play. I guess we already saw that in match play, sorry. And the Rule 11 situations that John's going to go over later, I guess next week, you're going to be playing from where the previous stroke was made. You can substitute a ball. When can you not substitute a ball? You cannot substitute a ball when replacing a ball on a spot. So examples of that. Anytime your ball is moved by an outside influence, Rule 9, somebody's walking down the course, they kick their own ball, an outside influence moves it, you are required to, quote, replace your ball, which means you have to use the original ball. Now there are exceptions, and again, there's a nice cross-reference, 14.2a. We're not going to go over them, But one obvious exception when we get to it is somebody else has hit your ball. To hit it into a penalty area. You're not required to go swimming for that ball. You can substitute. But that's because of Rule 14.2a. All right, let's look at sub 2. Substituted ball becomes ball in play. When a player substitutes another ball as the ball in play, notice the cross reference, 14.4, we just went over that. The original ball is no longer in play, even if it's at rest on the course. And this is true even if the player substituted another ball for the original ball when not allowed, or they replaced, dropped, or placed the substituted ball in a wrong way, a wrong place, or by using a procedure that did not apply. So again, once you substitute, that's the ball in play. The old ball is no longer in play. And this is true whether you got it right or you got it wrong. The next sentence talks about correcting an error under 14.5. So we're going to go over this in a week or two. If you drop the ball 3 club lengths outside of a relief area and you have to correct it, that ball is in play the minute you drop it. There it's sitting there on the course. But there's a rule that says you can correct it, and that's 14.5. If you don't correct it, you may get a penalty, but we're going to see that there's a rule that allows you to correct that. If the player's original ball has not been found and the player put another ball into play to take stroke and distance, i.e. he substituted a ball, or he's allowed under a rule when it's known or virtually certain what happened to the ball, such as you hit it into a penalty area, the player must continue play with the substituted ball. This is just what we went over. If you substitute a ball, you have to continue with that. The player, if it's known or virtually certain that you came under one of those rules. There's no correct once you've known or virtually certain that you're under one of those rules. So I don't know if I made that clear, but if you hit your ball towards a penalty area, you know it's in the penalty area, known or virtually certain. This is saying that when you then drop the ball to substitute it, the ball is in play and you cannot correct it under 14.5 because there's nothing to correct. You continue on with that ball. Improper substitution, well, let's finish this. The player must not play the original ball even if it's found on the course before the end of the 3-minute search. Making stroke at an incorrectly substituted ball. If a player makes a stroke at an incorrectly substituted ball, the player gets 1 penalty stroke that must play out the hole with the incorrectly substituted ball. This is a change for 2023. It used to be a 2-stroke penalty. Now it's a 1-stroke penalty. I guarantee this will be on the national exam, and it will be a player substitutes a ball when not allowed. He gets to the putting green and discovers that someone tells him that he shouldn't substitute. So then he puts his other ball back in play. How many penalty strokes does he get? And the answer is he gets 1 for the initial improper substitution, and he gets another 1 for the improper substitution because the rule says you have to continue with the ball put in play. You can't substitute for the substitute, at least without getting a penalty.
And because it was an interview with the bench.
Which was what? Making a stroke?
Yeah.
All right, 6.3, wrong ball. Again, one of the hardest concepts for beginners of the rules to understand. But the rule is simple. A player must not make a stroke at a wrong ball. So if you understand the definition of wrong ball, then you know you never make a stroke with it. It's just that simple. Exception, ball moving in water. There is no penalty if a player makes a stroke at a wrong ball that is moving in water in a penalty area or in temporary water. The stroke doesn't count and the player must correct. Notice what this exception does is it doesn't allow you to continue to play with the wrong ball. The only thing this exception does is it says we're not going to give you a penalty for having played a wrong ball. So your ball is lying in a creek, the water is flowing, you can't tell whether it's yours, you hit it up onto the fairway, You now go up and look and it's not your ball. You have played a wrong ball. This exception is saying you don't get a penalty, but you have to correct. Just like you have to correct anything. So if you then make another stroke to the hole, you're then going to get a penalty because that next stroke that you make is at a wrong ball, and that wrong ball is not in temporary water or a penalty area. Here's the penalty section. Broken down difference between match play and stroke play. In match play, it's simple. The player and the opponent play each other's ball. The first to make a stroke at a wrong ball gets the general penalty. Anyone who makes a stroke at a wrong ball in match play is going to get the general penalty, which means they lose the hole. Then we have what I think of as the idiot rule. But if it is not known which wrong ball was played first, there is no penalty and the hole must be played out with the balls exchanged. Quite bizarre that two people are playing a match. They discover maybe on the putting green that they've played each other a ball and they don't know when it happened. Well, if that occurs, the rules got you covered. What do you do in stroke play? In stroke play, this is the third of the 5 must corrects in the rules. In stroke play, the player gets the general penalty and must correct by continuing play with the original ball by playing it as it lies or taking relief under the rules. The stroke made with the wrong ball and any more strokes before the mistake is corrected, including strokes made and any additional penalty strokes solely from playing that ball, do not count. If the player does not correct the mistake before making a stroke to begin another hole or for the final hole, before returning their scorecard, the player is disqualified. Why is the player disqualified? Because they played a wrong ball. You can't score with the wrong ball. I know I've repeated myself, and there's a couple of very minor exceptions that I don't want to go into, but basically you cannot score with the wrong ball. That's why it's a must correct. How about the phrase that says you don't count any penalty strokes solely from playing that ball? There's a clarification on this. I don't want to go over it, but it's 6.3C1 parent 1 that simply gives some examples, and an example where it would not relate solely to that ball is the advice rule. Someone says, well, what are you going to do next? How should I play this shot? That is advice that could apply to either ball. The strokes that apply solely to that ball would be a penalty for accidentally kicking it or improving conditions affecting the stroke. Parent 2, what to do when player's ball was played by another player as a wrong ball. If it's known or virtually certain that the player's ball was played by another player as a wrong ball, the player must replace the original ball or another ball on the original spot, which if known must be, which if not known must be estimated. See Rule 14.2. Again, another reference. If you don't quite know how to do that, you go to 14.2 and on you go. This applies whether or not the original ball has been found. I think I've given this example in the past, but it's such a good one. And since Phil is sitting here, I'll tell it again. We had a situation at Strawberry Creek on the 11th tee. The player hit his shot way to the right, and over these mounds, you can't see the 10th fairway. And the player struck his ball over there. Well, it takes him a few minutes. He finally gets up there and he can't find his ball. So he calls the rules official over and he says, I know somebody up in the group ahead, perhaps on the 11th tee or green, has picked up my ball. Can I substitute another one? And the answer is no. You have 3 minutes to find your ball. You got there, you got 3 minutes. It must be known or virtually certain that someone else has played your ball before you get to place another ball on the spot. Notice that if you are sure that the other player had played, it's known or virtually certain. And one way would be when the player on the 11th green says, oh, gets in his cart and comes back and says, I played your ball, then you know. Notice that it says you must replace the original ball or another ball on the original spot. You place it, you don't drop it. Why? Because you're replacing the ball. The goal is to get it back into the spot that it was in. If you don't know the spot, what are you going to do? You're going to estimate it. How do we know? Because 14.2 is going to tell us that. Last section, 6.3. When player may play more than one ball at a time. A player may play more than one ball at a time on a hole only when, and these are the two circumstances, and we know this, playing a provisional ball, which will either become the ball in play or be abandoned. John's going to talk about this when we talk about 18. Or you can play two balls in stroke play to correct a possible serious breach from playing from a wrong place. But remember, when you're playing these two balls, neither of those balls are the ball in play. You only have one ball in play. You could have one or two purgatory balls that we'll see whether they do or do not get elevated to the ball in play. So let's go over, Lee. The question that was sent to me, Lee sent me the question. I'm not trying to hide it, but the question was, in stroke play, a player tees off from the teeing area and hits his ball out of bounds. He substitutes another ball with the intent to play under penalty of stroke and distance, but instead of teeing in the teeing area, he tees the substituted ball several inches in front of the tee marker. He plays out the hole with the substituted ball, tees off in the next hole. Is the player disqualified? If not, does he get a penalty? If he gets a penalty, what does he get? All right, a couple questions. When did his original ball first become the ball in play?
When he made a stroke.
When he made a stroke. When did the original ball become not in play? When it was out of bounds. What would have been the result if he had played the ball from out of bounds?
It's a wrong ball.
It's a wrong ball. Why? Because it's one of the four. May a player substitute another ball for the original ball? Yes, we just went over that. How does the player get the substituted ball back in play after the original ball is out of play? He goes to rule 14.4 and does one of two things. He either plays a ball from the teeing area or he drops, places, or returns the ball with the intent for it to be in play. As the substituted ball is sitting on the tee several inches in front of the tee markers, is the ball in play or is it a wrong ball?
It's in play.
Everybody see that?
Yeah.
Why? Because you intended to put that ball in play. It may be a wrong place. You're probably not allowed to set it on a tee, but you intended to put that into play. That is a substituted ball. When the player played the substituted ball from several inches in front of the tee markers, did he play a wrong ball? No, because it's the ball in play. Must he correct? Why? Because he has played a ball that is properly in play.
Well,
What?
He didn't gain significant advantage.
It's a wrong place, but not serious.
Right, we're talking about in play, wrong ball. We're not talking about wrong place yet. Now the question is, what's the effect of playing the ball in front of the tee markers? He has played from a wrong place. Everybody get that? And what happens if you play from a wrong place? You get a 2-stroke penalty. We haven't talked about serious breach. We'll talk about that in 14.7. I hope you all understand that playing 1 foot outside of the relief area or where you're supposed to play from is not going to be a serious breach when you're teeing off. When you're teeing off a second time.
This is a 2 + 1 = 2.
So the question is, how many penalty strokes does he get? Everybody agrees he gets 2 for playing from a wrong place.
Right.
Does he get 1 for the ball he hit out of bounds?
Yeah. Right.
Yes. How do we know that? Rule 1.3C4 tells us, I think that's the last paragraph of that section that says, but in any event, you're going to always get a penalty for a penalty stroke for a lost ball or a ball out of bounds.
So it's 1 for stroke and distance, 2 for wrong place,
Yes.
none for substitution because he's allowed to substitute under.
Right,
under that.
exactly.
So, yeah.
And what about the fact that he put the ball on the tee? That's subsumed, which would presumably be a wrong technique, wrong procedure. That's subsumed in the wrong place. So he gets only the 2-stroke penalty for that, plus the 1 for stroke and distance. Okay. 6.4. Order of play when playing hole. 6.4 covers the order of play throughout a hole. The order of play from the teeing area depends on who has the honor, and after that is based on which ball is further from the hole. That is 99% of the time that you're ever playing golf, right there in that sentence. That's all you got to know. Now, unfortunately, we have 3 or 4 pages after that that we have to go over because they're little nits and gnats. But remember, if you're a rules official, 99% of them is in that first paragraph. In match play, the order of play is fundamental. If a player plays out of turn, the opponent may cancel that stroke and make the player play again. In stroke play, there is no penalty for playing out of turn. Players are both allowed and encouraged to play ready golf. So let's look at match play, order play. The player and the opponent must play in this order, starting a hole. At the first hole, the honor decided by the order of the draw set by the committee, if there is no draw, or by agreement or by using a random method. The definition of honor, it's one sentence, and it is the right to play first from the teeing area. That's it. And it's going to be on every national test you ever see. And it's always going to be the guy's in the middle of the fairway. His ball is farther from the hole. The player is said to have honors. No, because honors only applies on the teeing area. The order of the draw set by the committee. Normally when in match play, there'll be a chart and the person on top is considered the one that has the top of the draw. So they're going to play first. Starting all other holes. The player who wins the hole has the honor at the next teeing area. If the hole is tied, the player with the honor at the previous teeing area keeps it. If the player makes a timely ruling request that has not yet been decided by the committee and could affect who has the honor is decided by agreement or using a random method. So an example of that is player A says he won the hole because player B touched the sand in the bunker and there's some dispute whether that's a violation or not. Well, if player A is disqualified, loses that hole, then player B would be up, and if they can't decide, they either do it by agreement or a flip of a coin. After both players start a hole, the ball that's furthest from the hole is to be played first. What's interesting is how often in match play it says, well, you're on the putting green, so I have to play first. Well, that's not the rule. The rule is strictly a distance measurement. So this happened at the women's match play this summer. One of the women was in the bunker 10 feet from the hole, and her opponent was on the putting green about 30 feet away. And she said, well, doesn't she have to play first? And I said, no, it's the one who is furthest from the hole. So the one putts before the other one hits her ball out of the bunker. Opponent may cancel player's stroke made out of turn. If the player plays when it was the opponent's turn to play, there's no penalty, but the opponent may cancel the stroke. This must be done promptly and before either player makes another stroke. When the opponent cancels the stroke, they cannot withdraw the cancellation. It's not uncommon in 4-ball to have A-B playing C-D and both A and B play from the wrong teeing area, or what are we talking about, play out of order. The question is, what can you recall? And the answer is you can only recall the most recent stroke. So if A, B play out of turn, then C, D have the right to cancel only the stroke made by B, not the stroke made by A. If the opponent cancels the stroke, the player must, when it's their turn to play a ball from where that stroke was made. Again, another very nice cross-reference to 14.6. When we get to 14.6, we're going to see that that's the rule that tells you how you make a stroke from where the previous stroke was made. Exception, playing out of turn to save time. The player may invite the opponent to play out of turn or may agree to the opponent's request to play out of turn. However, if the player then makes a stroke out of the turn, has given up his right to cancel the stroke. In match play, you have no obligation to accept this invitation. You may want to for pace of play purposes, but you don't have to. An example that they usually give is someone leaves their club on the 9th green, they get to the 10th tee, and he says, well, I have to go back to the 9th tee. Why don't you go ahead and hit? If you hit and it's not your turn, you're not going to get the stroke canceled for playing out of order. Stroke play. Normal order of play. Starting first hole, the honor at the first teeing area is decided by the order of the draw set by the committee. And again, normally there will be a starting sheet and it'll say on hole number 1, it's Mary, Sue, and Harriet. Well, that's the order of the draw. Starting on all other holes, the player in the group with the lowest gross score at a hole has the honor at the next teeing area, the player with the second lowest gross score. If 2 or more players have the same, they should play in the same order. The honor is based on gross score, even in a handicap competition. Notice that this is different than match play. This will always be on the national exam. And the reason is because in stroke play, handicap strokes are not added on a per hole basis. They are only added once the competition is final. So if you shot a 90, you would, and you have an 18 handicap, the committee will give you a 72 when your round is over, even though you, quote, bogeyed every hole. So if somebody else parred every hole, they would have the honor. After all players have started a hole, the ball that's furthest from the hole should be played first. Again, this is stroke play. If 2 or more balls are the same distance or it's unknown, the ball to be played first should be decided by agreement or by using a random method or by having just one of them play, because we know that you can play ready golf. There's no penalty for playing out of turn, except that if 2 or more players agree to play out of turn to give one of them an advantage and one of them then plays out of turn, each player who made the agreement gets the general penalty. An example of that would be you're playing the finals, you're at the, it's at Blackhawk, which is a par 3 18th hole, and it's you and it's Phil and I playing, and Phil says, you know, Dan, why don't you hit first, because you're so far out of it, you're not going to win anything. But if I can get a 2 on this hole, I then can beat John, who's already in with whatever his score is. And I say, well, that's a great idea. So then I hit first for the express purpose of helping Phil decide that he should hit an 8-iron rather than 7-iron. That's what this rule is getting to. If a player just plays out of turn, there is no penalty. It's the agreement to play out of turn to give one of them an advantage. Ready golf, parent 2, you're allowed and encouraged to play out of turn in a safe and responsible way. This hardly ever comes up in stroke play, although it did come up at the women's amateur a year or 2 ago. 2 women tied in the state amateur. They went to the 19th hole because it was a playoff. And one of the women was ready to play, and the other person, or actually her caddy, a very sophisticated caddy, says, she can't play, it's my turn to play. And I said, well, wait a minute, understand this is not match play. This is stroke play. And she kind of looked at me like, oh, yeah, I guess that's right. So you're still playing stroke play, even though you're in a playoff and there's just 2 people. What's the rule? You can play ready golf. However, if the other person is prepared to play and it's her turn to play, you should allow them. So that I told the 2 players, look, if the other person's ready, she gets to play in a discussion. So that's where that was resolved. All right, 6.4C, one player will play provisional ball or another ball from the teeing area. The order of play in this case for all players in the group to make their first stroke on the hole before the player playing the provisional ball or another ball from the teeing area. So at the teeing area, it's different than on the course. In the teeing area, you recycle. So it's A, B, C, D. And you hit, if one of those people is going to hit a provisional, he waits or she waits until everybody else goes. It's a recycling. If more than one player will play a provisional ball or another ball from the teeing area, the order of the play is same as the order as before. In other words, it's A, B, C, D. One player is taking relief or will play a provisional ball from anywhere except the teeing area. And this gets into the question of whether you are playing because you're required to take stroke and distance or whether you have a choice. So let's go through this. When player becomes aware that they are required, emphasize the word required, to take stroke and distance relief, the player's order of play is based on the spot where the previous stroke was made from. So you're in the middle of the fairway, you hit your ball out of bounds, you know it's out of bounds, you hit next. Why? Because it's your turn to play. The next provision says when a player has a choice to play as it lies or take relief, the player's order of play is based on the spot where the original ball lies. So an example of that is I'm in the middle of the fairway, and instead of hitting my ball out of bounds, I hit it into a penalty area right up by the putting green. Well, we all know, I think we know, we'll get to 17, we'll know for sure, that you have three options, one of which is stroke and distance, which would mean you would play first. At least that would be what you'd be thinking. Or you may take your 2 club lengths up by the green. And what this rule is saying, if you have a choice, the order of play is where the original ball lies. So it doesn't make any difference what you actually choose. Once you hit your ball into the penalty area that is ahead of B's ball, closer to the hole, B is going to play next. That's the end of the discussion. And there'll be a question on the national exam to that effect, and it'll probably say something. And A has already decided that they will play under penalty of stroke and distance. Doesn't make any difference. The question is, does the player have a choice? And if the player has a choice, then this is the rule that applies. All right, playing provisional ball. The order of play is for the player to play the provisional ball right after making the previous stroke and before anyone else plays a ball, except when starting a hole, we've just gone over that, or when the player waits before deciding. So again, if I'm in the middle of the fairway, it's my turn to play, and I hit it towards out of bounds, and I say, yeah, I think that one's out of bounds. I got to play a provisional. I play before the other player. If I am undecided and the other player plays, the other player has played in the correct order because I've waited too long. I haven't made the decision to play. All right, let's finish up 6.5, completing play of a hole. Player has completed a hole in match play when player holes out or the player's next stroke is conceded or the result of the hole is decided, which could be a concession, it could be loss of hole. In stroke play, when the hole is completed, when the player holes out under 3.3. And we know that if they don't hole under 3.3, they're going to be disqualified. If the player does not know that they have completed a hole and attempts to continue play of a hole, the player's further play is not considered to be practice, nor do they get a penalty for playing another ball, including a wrong ball. What does that mean? An example of that would be you're playing one of my favorite courses, the 13th at Oconomowoc or the 13th at Meadow Valley, both par fours with elevated greens. You hit your second shot, you think it's pretty good, you get up there, you can't find it. You look in the bunker behind, you still can't find it. Meanwhile, the other person has hit it a foot away, and he says, well, so you go up there, and then you see that your ball, and then you played another one, and you get up there and you see your ball's in the hole. You completed the hole with a 2. So what this is saying is that any continuation of that hole, we're not going to treat that as practice on the course. All right, questions on Rule 6?
One online. And the question states, player tees off and ball hits a tree and ends back up in the teeing area. Player tees off a substituted ball and finishes the hole. Is there a penalty?
I assume everybody heard that online. The question is there a penalty when the player hits his ball, it hits a tree, comes back into the teeing area? The teeing area rules allow you to lift or move your ball without penalty. So the answer is you do not get a penalty for lifting that ball or moving it. Since it's in the teeing area, what can you do? You can play it on the ground or you can play it from a tee.
But the question is, he substituted it. He
Yeah.
substituted another ball.
Yeah, okay, the question is, and he substituted, do you get a penalty for substituting a ball? No, because the teeing area rules specifically say you can play the original ball or another ball from the teeing area. All right, Rule 7 is a fairly short rule, and we should be able to zip through that pretty quick. Ball search, finding and identifying ball. Purpose of the rule. Rule 7 allows the player to take reasonable actions to fairly search for their ball in play after each stroke. We'll come back to those words, but those are magic. Reasonable actions and fairly search. But the player still must be careful, as a penalty will apply if the player acts excessively and causes improvements to cats. The player gets no penalty if the ball is accidentally moved in trying to find or identify it, but must then replace the ball in its original spot. Playing ball, the player may take reasonable actions to find and identify the ball. The first sentence is something what every rules official should know. The player is responsible for finding their ball in play after each stroke. So when the irate parent says to you, your job is to find my son's ball, you say, no, it is a player is responsible for finding the ball. And if you think that I made that up, one of my favorite stories is on the second hole at University Ridge. Chuck Heath was the rules official on the second hole. I was on, which is a par 5. I was on the third hole. And this woman approaches me as I'm standing on the third hole, irate, telling me I have to fire that rules official on the second hole. And I said, what happened, ma'am? And she said, well, he couldn't find my son's ball. That's his one job. And so I listened to her and then off she went. But it was such an interesting thought in my mind. So I got in my cart and I drove up to the second hole and I said, okay, Chuck, I got it. What's the story? And Chuck said he was sitting in his cart. The player hit his second shot, snapped it very sharply left, hit the cart that Chuck was in, scared the bejesus out of Chuck, and the ball went flying. And they searched, this is under the old rules, they searched for 5 minutes. They could not find it. And then Chuck Heath says, I'm sorry, sir, your ball's lost. Meanwhile, there's a ball in the middle of the fairway. The player goes down and he says, well, here's my ball. And Chuck Heath says correctly, I'm sorry, your ball's lost. Well, that's what set the mother off. She says, not only does the guy not find the ball, but then when he finds it, he says it's lost. So you should fire this guy. Player may fairly search for the ball by taking reasonable actions. So look what it says. You can move sand and water. You can bend grass, bushes, tree branches, and other growing or attached natural objects, and also break such objects, but only if such breaking is a result of other reasonable actions taken to find or identify the ball. If in taking such reasonable actions as part of a fair search improves the conditions affecting the stroke, there is no penalty under 8.1 if the improvement results from a fair search. So it all depends on whether your search is a fair search. There's a fairly good clarification, 7.1A1. Examples of actions unlikely to be part of a fair search. And it gives 3 examples. Taking an action to flatten grass beyond what is reasonably necessary to walk through or search for the ball. So you can walk through tall grass You can take your club, you can swing it slightly from left to right to see it, but you can't intentionally step down the grass in hopes that when you find your ball, you'll have a better lie. You can't take purposely removing any growing. You can't rip stuff out of the ground. You can move it to the side, but you can't rip it out. And breaking a tree branch to allow easy access to the ball when it could have been reached without doing so. It's a good one to keep in mind when the question comes up, can you fairly search? And it's fairly typical on a course where you have tall grass that is right in front of the putting green, that the player will get quite aggressive in trying to find that ball, knowing that if they find it and the grass is moved, they'll have a little better shot at the ball. All right, last sentence. But if the improvement results from actions that exceed what's reasonable, then you're going to get the general penalty. And in trying to find or identify the ball, the player may remove loose impediments as allowed under 15.1 and may remove movement obstructions as allowed under 15.2. 7.1D, what to do if sand affecting lie of player's ball is moved while trying to find it. This is an interesting rule because it's not talking about moving the ball, you're only moving the sand. So if you're looking for a ball in the bunker and the ball is completely buried, you're looking for it, maybe you brush the sand away and all of a sudden your ball shows up, the ball hasn't moved. What this is saying, the player must recreate the original lie in the sand, but may leave a small part of the ball visible if the ball had been covered by sand. So you are required to reach down with your hand and push the sand back to recreate that lie, and you can leave a little bit uncovered. How to identify the ball. There are 3 ways that a ball may be identified. By the player or anyone else seeing a ball come to rest in circumstances where it is known to be the player's ball. In that sentence, the word a is very interesting. You have to see a ball. So an example would be, I tee off, my ball goes, it doesn't go 250 anymore. So maybe it goes 200 and it goes into a palm tree. And I get up there and there's a spectator there. And the spectator says, "Oh yeah, I saw a ball. Yeah, so right up in that palm tree or that palm tree." And you look around, you don't see it. You haven't identified it because you don't see a ball. The person, you say, "Well, are you sure it's in there?" And they say, "Yes, I'm sure it's in there." Well, you haven't found your ball and you haven't identified it. If you see a ball and you say to the spectator, "Well, is it that one right there?" And the spectator says, "Yeah, that's the one. I saw it come up. And that's the one." You have now identified it as your ball because the spectator saw a ball come to rest and knows that that's the ball that was just hit. Second example, by seeing the player's identifying mark on the ball, but this does not apply if an identical ball with an identical identifying mark is also found. So again, the beauty of the WIAA state tournament is it leads to endless rules. Examples, we had a situation that was the girls tournament. The way it's set up is that the number 3 players play ahead of the number 2 girls. And they had 2 girls, both on the same team. Their coach gave them both tailor-made 4s, a sleeve, and they had their logo on it. And I asked the girl, "Did you have an identifying mark on your ball?" And she says, "Yes, it was a tailor-made 4 and it had a school logo. It was a bird of some sort." So I asked the other girl and she said the same thing. Well, neither one of those girls had an identifying mark on their ball that would separate them from any other ball. So both of those balls were then unidentified and therefore lost. All right, third example, by finding a ball with the same brand, model, number, and condition as the player's ball, where the player's ball is expected to be, but this does not apply if you have another one that's identical, and that's just what I went through. All right, lifting ball to identify it. If a ball might be a player's ball but cannot be identified as it lies, the player may lift the ball to identify it, including by rotating it, but the spot of the ball must first be marked and the ball must not be cleaned more than needed to identify it. This is one of those rules where Notice that you are not allowed to clean your ball when you lift it, but you can clean enough of it if you can't see your little blue dot or whatever you use, you can scrape that amount off to do so. If the lifted ball is the player's ball or another ball, it must be replaced. How do you replace a ball? Well, there's the rule that tells you how, 14.2, and we'll see that in a couple of weeks. If the player lifts their ball under this rule when not reasonably necessary to identify it, except on the putting green, fails to mark it, blah, 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 they're going to get a 1 penalty stroke. It's very unusual that a person will lift their ball when it's not reasonable to identify it. I can think of an example, but it would be very bizarre, and that's the ball sitting right in the middle of the fairway, and you get there and its title is 4, and the word Phil is written right on top, and you look down and your name's Phil, and well, I don't know if that's me there. Maybe there's another Phil playing this course, so you pick it up to identify. That would probably be unreasonable. All right, last section of 7.4, ball accidentally moved in trying to find or identify. There's no penalty if the player's ball is accidentally moved by the player, opponent, or anyone else while trying to identify it. But if the player causes the ball to move before they start to search for the ball, the player gets a 1-stroke penalty under Rule 9.4. The issue that comes up there is you must have started your search. So an example, and this actually happened in a WSGA event, the player hit her ball and kind of hooked into the woods, and the rules official came over from the other side of the fairway. The player came up, parked the cart, started talking to the rules official, sort of a pleasant conversation, nothing too extravagant. She got out of the cart and she stepped on her ball. That's an example where the player has not started the search. And in that case, you get a 1-stroke penalty under Rule 9.4. Because the key is, where did you think the ball was likely to be? Where did you estimate it to be? And she was thinking that the ball went into the woods and actually hit a tree and came back. Under this rule, accidentally includes when the ball is moved by anyone taking reasonable actions to find the ball that were likely to reveal the ball's location by moving it, such as sweeping feet through long grass. So we talked about this. You can take a club and move the grass to the side. In these situations, the ball must be replaced on its original spot, which if not known must be estimated. And again, the reference there to Rule 14.2. And in doing so, the ball was moved on, under, or against an immovable obstruction, integral object, boundary object, or growing or attached national object, you must replace it against such object. The ball was covered by sand. The original ball must be recreated. That's slightly different than the first one under 7.1b, because there the ball wasn't moved, just the lie was changed. Here they're saying if you actually move the ball, then you must recreate the lie. Penalty, general penalty for this. Questions on Rule 7?
Yeah. So we're going to take a little break. We got, we'll do a 10-minute break. We're just going to work on switching some technology over for us in Golf House now to be able to hear John as he will be going over rules 8, 9, and 10 virtually. So we'll be back in 10 minutes. All right, we are back. So again, if you have questions online, just please type it in the chat and make sure we'll answer those questions after John gets done with each rule. John, you available?
Yeah, Jeff, thank you. Good morning, everybody. We will resume.
I'm going to go on mute here, John, and then I'll let you start, okay?
All right, so sounds good.
All right.
I will just assume that if I tell a joke, everyone's laughing hysterically, and we'll go on that, proceed on that basis, even though I can't hear. We'll resume with Rule 8, which is a very big rule, both in terms of philosophy and the amount of content. And it supports one of the two underlying principles we saw in Rule 1 behind the rules, and that is playing the course as it is found. We'll see the purpose of the rule. It covers that central principle that a player normally has to accept the conditions affecting the stroke and normally may not improve them. But there are certain reasonable actions the player may take, even if they result in an improvement. And there are limited times where a player is allowed to restore certain conditions. So with Rule 8.1 covers conditions affecting the stroke. So let's start by looking at that definition, conditions affecting the stroke, which is found on page 332. And that is conditions of affecting the stroke is really just kind of a catch-all phrase that includes the lie of the ball, the area of intended stance, area of intended swing, line of play, and the relief area where the player is going to drop or place a ball. Now, we'll see the terms lie, line of play, and relief area each has its own definition, but area of intended stance and area of intended swing do not. So we'll go ahead and clarify what those mean in this definition. The area of intended stance includes both where the player will place their feet and the entire area that might reasonably affect how and where the player's body is positioned in preparing for and making the intended stroke. So area of intended stance is more than just where the player's feet are. And that's important. It doesn't, while it might not come up that often, this is what would allow the player to take relief if, let's say, he has interference from a low-lying wall that is on the course. It's not a boundary wall or fence that, say, hits his backside, but otherwise doesn't interfere with his feet or the path of the club. That if it hit by hitting his body and interfering with that, it's considered to interfere with the area of intended stance. So therefore, the player is entitled to relief. Next, area of intended swing includes the entire area that might reasonably affect the backswing, the downswing, and the follow-through. Next definition, let's look at improve, which is an important one for this rule on page 338, because we'll see that this rule, Rule 8.1, all talks about improving the conditions affecting the player's stroke. So we just talked about what the conditions affecting the stroke are, but improve is the second and vital key element to the rule. Improve means to alter one or more conditions affecting the stroke, which we just discussed, or other physical conditions affecting play, which we'll talk about rules 8.2 and 8.3, so that the player gains a potential advantage for a stroke. So that's important. So improve means to alter so the player gains a potential advantage. That, in other words, is there a penalty if, well, as we'll see, the rule, there won't be a breach if a player worsens, for example, his line of play. There's no rule against that. There's just a rule against improving your line of play by taking certain actions. And the other key point here is that we're talking about a potential advantage. not an actual advantage. So, for example, imagine a player is a yard off the putting green intending to use his putter, and there's a pitch mark that had been there before on his line of play in the fringe of the putting green, and he thinks it might interfere with his play, so he repairs it. And as we'll see, that's a prohibited action, repairing that irregularity of surface on his line of play, because that created a potential advantage because his ball might now roll more smoothly. So if he does that and then he putts, but his ball never actually touches that repaired area, that would still be a breach. So it's not whether there is an actual advantage gained, it's just whether that improvement resulted in a potential advantage. And that's an important point. Next, let's look at the definition of lie on page 341. The lie is the spot on which a ball is at rest and any growing or attached natural object, immovable obstruction, integral object, or boundary object touching the ball or right next to it. So if a player's ball is right up against let's say a boundary stake, that boundary stake would be considered part of the lie of the ball. Now, it's worth noting what is not part of the lie of the ball, and that is loose impediments and movable obstructions. And that's important in that, for example, if a player is, let's say, lifting his ball, and while doing so, some loose impediments, let's say some pine straw is moved, that when it's time to replace the ball, he does not have a lie altered situation. Because since the pine straw is not part of the lie, that if the pine straw is no longer there, the lie has not been altered. Next definition is line of play, which is right under it. Line of play is the line where the player intends their ball to go after a stroke, including area on that line that's a reasonable distance up above the ground and on either side of that line. So because players don't always hit the ball exactly where they want, we have this definition provides for that reasonable distance up above the ground and on either side of that. Now, the line of play is not necessarily a straight line, but it may be a curved line. For example, if a player has to bend a ball around a tree, his line of play would likely be curved. And notice that the line of play is not necessarily toward the hole. In fact, there's no reference to the hole. In that, for example, if I hit my tee shot into the trees and I need to just pitch out sideways, my line of play is back to the fairway at right angles to where the hole actually is. So line of play is just where you want your ball to go. And somewhat frustratingly, we don't always or not always trying to hit our ball toward the hole. Last definition is stance on page 360. Stance, fairly straightforward, the position of a player's feet and body in preparing for and making a stroke. So key there is that the stance is more than just where the feet are. So with that in mind, let's dive into Rule 8.1. And, it starts by saying that the purpose of this rule is to support the principle of playing the course as you find it, and therefore restricts what a player is allowed to do to improve some of these protected areas. What we just talked about with the conditions affecting the stroke. This rule applies to actions taken during the round and while play is stopped. So if play has been stopped, let's say for darkness and your ball's under a tree, you can't come out overnight and start breaking branches off the tree to give yourself a better swing. But it's important to note that this rule does not apply to the removal of loose impediments or movable obstructions, which is covered in Rule 15, which we'll cover in a couple of weeks. Now, with that, as we'll see, that with this rule, it prohibits improving the conditions affecting the stroke, but only by taking specific actions. So if there's an action that's not prohibited by this rule that also happens to improve, say, one of the conditions affecting the stroke, that is okay. And that, for example, if player's ball is on the fairway and there's a big pine cone 1 foot in front of his ball, and he removes that pine cone, has he improved his line of play? The answer is yes. He's made his line of play better. He's gained a potential advantage. But removing loose impediments is not a prohibited action under Rule 8.1a. So therefore, there's no breach. And final bullet point: if an action taken while a player's ball is in motion is covered by Rule 11, not by this rule. So with all that, now let's look at Rule 8.1a. And it's worthwhile and actually important to keep in mind that Rule 8.1 contains 4 sections. And in several situations, you actually need to read through sections A, B, and C in order to determine, and sometimes D also, to determine if there has been a breach. In other words, and we'll talk about this again, don't stop reading after only 8.1a, because sometimes you'll get the wrong answer if you stop at 8.1a. And that's referenced in the introductory phrase there, except in the limited ways allowed in 8.1b, C, and D, player must not take any of these actions if they improve the conditions affecting the stroke. So we have some exceptions. Keys are, we're talking about improvement, which means gaining a potential advantage, but we're also talking about just the conditions affecting the stroke. And we're also talking about only these 5 categories of actions. So unless all 3 of those criteria are met, there's not going to be a breach of Rule 8.1a. And notice with this rule that this is not an intent-based rule, that it says a player must not take any of these actions if they improve the conditions affecting the stroke. So regardless of whether the player was trying to help himself out, the player would be penalized. That whether it was a deliberate act or an accidental act, if it improves one of these conditions through one of these prohibited actions, the player would be in breach of this rule. So let's look at the prohibited actions. 1, the player is not allowed to move, bend, or break any growing or attached natural object, such as grass, tree branches, etc. So growing certainly applies to things that are alive, and attached could be a dead tree. Just because a tree is no longer growing, the branches are still attached, so you can't break them off. Players not allowed to move, bend, or break an immovable obstruction, integral object, or boundary object. So this is the prohibition. Most golfers know they're not allowed to remove boundary stakes to improve, for example, their area of intended swing, and this is the rule that prohibits that. Likewise, a player is not allowed to remove a tee marker for the teeing area when playing a ball from that teeing area. But this is important that with the tee marker, we're just talking about only the player who moves that tee marker, and doing so improves, for example, the area of intended stance or area of intended swing. So if a player is trying really hard to tee up on the left side of a teeing area, but there's a tall tee marker there that's in the way and the player moves it for that purpose, that he would be in breach of this provision. If the player moves a loose impediment or movable obstruction into position, the player is in breach. Most common application of this would be building a stance. For example, this is what would prohibit a player from kneeling on a towel to play a ball, or from, say, moving a bench to underneath a tree so the player can hop up on that bench to play a ball that's on a tree branch. 3, a player is not allowed to alter the surface of the ground, including by replacing divots in a divot hole. So, for example, if if you're in the fairway and where you intend to place your left foot is an empty divot hole, you're not allowed to replace a divot in that hole to even things out. Players not allowed to remove or press down divots that have already been replaced. So, for example, if you want to place your left foot on a divot that's been replaced in the divot hole, but you can tell that the divot's shriveled up, that it never took root, and you're afraid your left foot might slip on it during the round, you're not allowed to remove that replaced divot. Or 3, the player, or third bullet, the player is not allowed to create or eliminate holes, indentations, or uneven surfaces. An example of that would be the pitch mark example on the fringe of the putting green. 4th prohibited act is removing or pressing down sand or loose soil. So, for example, if you're in a naturally sandy area and there's a mound of sand behind your ball, you're not allowed to remove that sand to improve the area of intended swing. And then 5, players not allowed to remove dew, frost, or water if doing so would improve one or more of the conditions affecting the stroke. Penalty for breach of this rule is the general penalty. But as we said, we need to keep reading to make sure whether there is a penalty. And just looking at that last category, that if we read only Rule 8.1a, for example, and a player is on the teen area and he removes dew from that teen area from where he's going to place his feet in order to reduce the chances of his feet slipping during the swing, if we read only 8.1a, we would conclude that there's a penalty, wouldn't we? But as we'll see in the next section, that act is actually allowed. So so I mentioned that just as an example to emphasize the need to keep reading to get the full picture as to whether there would be a breach of the rule. Now, Rule 8.1b talks about actions that are allowed. So a player may take any of these actions and there's no penalty, even if doing so improves the conditions affecting the stroke. So these are really exceptions to 8.1a. Dan touched on earlier in Rule 7.1a, if a player fairly searches for their ball by taking reasonable actions, and that happens to improve, for example, the lie of the ball, there's no penalty. 2, if the player takes reasonable actions to remove loose impediments or movable obstructions, and that happens to, let's say, for example, or the removal of loose impediment, the player also causes some tall grass near the ball to be pressed down, but the player took reasonable acts to do that. There would be no breach, even if the lie of the ball was improved. With the key is that as long as that was a reasonable action. 3, if the player is allowed to take reasonable actions to mark the spot of the ball and to lift and replace it under the rules. Let's say a player's hit his ball into tall fescue. He finds a ball. He's not sure if it's his, so he's going to lift it for identification. And while he's taking reasonable actions to lift and replace the ball, he happens to improve the lie of the ball a little bit. Is that would not be a breach because of this provision. 4, player is allowed to ground the club lightly, emphasis on lightly, right in front of or right behind the ball. And lightly means that the weight of the club is supported by the grass, soil, or sand. But this provision does not allow the player to press the club into the ground, because if he presses it into the ground, he's no longer grounding it lightly. And if that improves, for example, the lie of the ball, he would be in breach of this rule. And likewise, let's remember the bunker rule, which we'll get to next week under Rule 12, that a player is not allowed to touch the sand right in front of or behind the ball. Fifth action that is allowed is firmly placing the feet and taking the stance. And that includes some digging in sand or loose soil. Six, player is allowed to fairly take a stance by taking reasonable actions to get to the ball and take a stance. So keywords, fairly, reasonable actions, both to get to the ball and to take a stance. But in so doing, the player is not entitled to a normal stance or swing, and the player must use the least intrusive course of action to deal with the particular situation. And that phrase, least intrusive course of action, is one of the most useful phrases in the whole book to rules officials. Because if you can just keep that in mind when you are dealing with, for example, a player under a tree or something like that, in terms of what is and is not allowed, that is very helpful. So a good way to look at this is that it's up to the player to decide how he's going to play the ball, in terms of whether he's going to hit it right-handed or left-handed, if he's going to play toward the green, punch out sideways, play backwards. That's up to him. And this rule does not handicap him in that decision. What this rule does, though, is restrict him as to what he can do once he makes that determination. And that once the player decides that, let's say, for example, his ball's under a tree and he's going to play out sideways, that it's then his responsibility to get his body into the position for that sideways stroke using the least intrusive course of action. So he's responsible for doing that. And a good way to look at it is to say, well, is there another way the player could have gotten his body into that position with causing less improvement to the conditions affecting the stroke? Seventh action is making a stroke or the backswing for a stroke that is then made. So this applies only when a stroke is made. If a player makes his backswing and is rattled or distracted and then stops his swing and does not make the stroke, this exception does not apply. But when the ball's in a bunker, touching the sand in the bunker with the backswing is not allowed. So in the bunker, as we'll see next week, if you touch the sand with your backswing, no matter what, it's going to be a penalty. But let's say a player is in a naturally sandy area, like for example at Sand Valley, that's not a bunker, and he has a mound of sand behind the ball, and while making his backswing, he removes that mound of sand, and he continues and makes the stroke. This means there would be no breach of the rules for that case. But if he removes that sand and then stops, then he is going to be penalized. 8, in the teen area, the player is allowed to place on tee on the ground, is allowed to move, bend, or break anything growing or attached that's natural, and alter the surface of the ground, remove or press down sand and loose soil, and remove dew, frost, or water. So back to the example of the player who removes dew from the teen area, from the spot from which he intends to place his feet, this says that that is okay. And that's a good example of how you need to read Rule 8.1b in order to know whether there's been a breach of 8.1a. 9, in a bunker, players allowed to smooth sand to care for the course after a ball played from the bunker is outside the bunker. And let's look at clarification 8.1b/5 for an example of that. That's a good one. Starts on the bottom of page 118. After a ball in a bunker is played and is now outside the bunker, certain rules use care of the course to allow the player to restore the bunker to the condition it should be in, even if the restoring improves the conditions affecting the stroke. This is so true even if the player's action is deliberately taken both to care for the course and to improve the conditions affecting the stroke. So in those last two sentences, we have two even ifs. Even if the restoring improves the conditions affecting the stroke, something that's normally not allowed, and even if the action is deliberate, partly to care for the course and partly to improve conditions affecting the stroke. So in other words, this qualification about caring for the course is not the sole criterion. As long as that's one of the reasons the player is smoothing sand, this would apply. And again, as long as the ball is outside the bunker. So let's look at a useful example here. The player's ball comes to rest in a large bunker near a putting green. Player's not able to play toward the hole, so the player plays backwards. And the ball comes to rest outside the bunker. So that's important. The ball is outside the bunker. In this case, the player may smooth the areas they had altered as a result of playing the ball, and may also smooth any other areas in the bunker, whether created by the player or those that were already present from previous groups when the player arrived to play from the bunker. So raking that area is on his line of play. And since it's just a short pitch shot over the bunker, has he created a potential advantage by raking that bunker? Yeah, because there's it's reasonable that his next shot could wind up in that bunker. So already our antennae are up in that he's improved, created a potential advantage by taking an act, smoothing sand on his line of play. But this provision provides that there's no penalty. So another reason why Rule 8.1b is important to know well. Number 10, on the putting green, the player is allowed to remove sand and loose soil and repair damage. And we'll see under Rule 13 next week the types of damage the player is allowed to repair. And with this provision, it's worthwhile to note that this applies regardless of where the player's ball is, whether the player's ball is on or off the putting green. And last, number 11, a player is allowed to move a natural object in order to see if it's loose. In other words, let's say you have a vine or some tall grass and you don't know if it's still attached or if it's broken off and is loose, in which case it'd be a loose impediment and you could move it. So it allows the player to make that determination, but the player needs to be careful, because if the object is found to be growing or attached, then it must stay attached and must be returned to its original position, so that the player does not ultimately gain that potential advantage, but he's at least allowed to determine its status, but he needs to be careful. All right, so those are exceptions to 8.1a. Acts a player is allowed to take even if it improves the conditions affecting the stroke. Now, 8.1c allows the player in some cases, not in all cases, but in some cases, to allows a player who's breached a rule to undo things and avoid penalty. So in other words, and this is important, so in other words, if a player does something that falls under 8.1a, first look at 8.1b to see if that act is covered by that rule. And if not, then we need to look at 8.1c to see whether the player is allowed to undo what he did and thereby avoid penalty. So if the player has improved the conditions affecting the stroke by moving, bending, or breaking an object in breach of 8.1a1, or moving an object into position under 8.1a2, the player is allowed some leeway. But if the player did something in breach of sections 3, 4, or 5 of 8.1a, the player does not have the opportunity to restore things and avoid penalty. So now we really need to pay attention to what exactly the player did. So if the player did breach 8.1a1 or 2, there's no penalty if before the next stroke, the player eliminates that improvement by restoring the original conditions as described below. But if the player improved the conditions affecting the stroke by taking actions prohibited by sections 3, 4, or 5 of the rule, then the player cannot avoid penalty. All right, so with 8.1A1, how to restore conditions that were improved by moving, bending, or breaking an object. Could be natural, could be artificial. Before the stroke, the player may avoid the penalty by restoring the original object. And as we'll see later, original is an important word. Original object as nearly as possible to its original position so that the improvement has been eliminated. For example, a boundary object, such as a boundary stake. If a player, let's say that Dan and I are playing together in a boundary stake, my ball's inbounds barely, but a boundary stake interferes with my backswing. If I remove the boundary stake and then Dan says, whoa, 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 John, what are you doing? You're not allowed to do that. And then I replace that boundary stake before I play, then I've avoided a penalty. Another situation is with a tree branch, that if I am under a tree taking my stance, and I take my stance not fairly, not using the least intrusive course of action, and let's say a rules official says, oh, John, that's not least intrusive, that if I then come out from the tree and that tree branch returns to its original position, so there's no longer that potential advantage, then there's no breach. And then the rules official can coach me perhaps as to what would be the least intrusive way to get to the ball. But the player cannot avoid penalty if the improvement is not eliminated, such as what happened if I picked up that boundary stake and snapped it over my knee. Then replacing it wouldn't do any good. Or if I use anything other than the original object. So if I pick up that boundary stake and toss it into a nearby river and it floats away, then I can't avoid penalty. Now, next section, how to restore conditions that were improved by moving an object into position. So using the examples we talked about before of kneeling on a towel. If I kneel on a towel to play a ball and Jeff says, John, you're not allowed to do that, then I get up, remove the towel, and then kneel back down on the ground, then I've avoided penalty. Or if I drag a bench over so I can stand on it to play a ball lying on a tree branch, then I would just correct that mistake by removing the bench. And each time I can avoid penalty. All right, now with 8.1b, and we're shifting, 8.1d, we're shifting gears a little bit, because here we're talking about a situation where the conditions affecting the stroke have been worsened. In the first 3 sections, we talked about improvements, but now we're talking about a situation where the conditions have been worsened, and that worsening took place after the player's ball came to rest. And the philosophical point behind this is that in general, a player is entitled to what his stroke gave him. And if something is worsened after his ball came to rest there, in many cases, the player's going to be allowed to restore the conditions to what they were when his ball came to rest. So first, when the restoration of worsened conditions is allowed, if the conditions affecting the stroke are worsened by a player other than the player, because if the player worsens something, then he gets what he gets and has himself to blame. Or by an animal, without penalty, the player may. So it's not a requirement, it's just an option for the player, and that's for the player's own good. So if the player doesn't know this rule and does not restore the worsened conditions, the player's not going to be penalized. The player may restore the original conditions as nearly as possible. So it could mean mark the spot of the ball and lift clean and replace it on its original spot if it's reasonable to do to restore the original conditions, or if material ended up on the ball when the conditions were worsened. So probably the most common example of that is, let's say a player's ball is on the fringe of the putting green. Another player in his group is in a greenside bunker immediately behind him, plays the bunker shot out and deposits a lot of sand on and around the player's ball and on his line of play on the fringe of the green. Now, normally, as we saw under 8.1a, a player is not allowed to remove sand to improve the lie of the ball or the line of play. But in this case, since that sand was deposited there after the player's ball came to rest there, the player would be allowed to lift clean, replace the ball, clean any sand off, as well as to remove that sand. Now, if the worsened conditions cannot be easily restored, the player may lift and replace the ball by placing it on the nearest spot, not near the hole, that has the most similar conditions affecting the stroke. It's within a club length and is in the same area of the course. So the whole point of this is trying to turn back the clock to what the player had when his ball came to rest there. So a good way to look at it is if the player started out with a good lie, then something happened, and then he got a bad lie, that he would then be allowed in most cases to restore things to a good lie. That doesn't mean he's now all of a sudden going to upgrade to a great lie. Just means to a good lie, to something similar to what he had when his ball came to rest. The exception to this is if the lie is worsened when or after the ball's lifted or moved and before it's been replaced. Rule 14.2d will cover that, unless, as we touched on last week, the lie was worsened when play was stopped and the ball was lifted, in which case this rule applies. All right, next section. When restoration of the worsened conditions is not allowed, a player must not improve the conditions affecting the stroke that have been worsened by the player, including the player's caddy, another player other than a referee taking an action authorized by the player, or natural forces. And we'll see here, as well as in Rule 9, that most of the time when natural forces are involved, we just have to accept the result, whether good or bad. If the player improves the worsened conditions, we're not allowed to do so. He gets the general penalty. So that's all Rule 8.1. A lot going on there. 4 big sections, but you just kind of have to take your time, work your way through them, and also understand the interconnections from between them, because they are dependent on each other, as we discussed, to get to the final answer. Now, let's talk about Rule 8.2. And this is going to be different in several ways from 8.1. This rule, as the title says, talks about the player's deliberate actions, so it's intent-based, to alter other physical conditions. And other physical conditions mean not the conditions affecting the stroke, to affect the player's own ball at rest or a stroke to be made. So 8.2 will talk about things from the player's perspective. 8.3 will talk about when another player's ball is involved. So first, when does Rule 8.2 apply? It covers a deliberate action. So unlike 8.1, this does not include accidental actions. It includes deliberate actions that were taken for the purpose of altering other physical conditions, meaning not conditions affecting the stroke, to affect the player's own ball at rest or the stroke that they will make. This rule does not apply to the player's actions to deliberately deflect or stop their own ball in motion. Rule 11 will talk about that, and does not apply to the player's actions that altered the conditions affecting the stroke because Rule 8.1a covers that. So now 8.2b. Player must not deliberately take one of the actions listed in 8.1a, keeping in mind that there are some exceptions to that, to alter any other physical conditions to affect where the player's ball might go or come to rest after their next stroke or later stroke, or where the player's ball at rest might go or come to rest if it moves before the stroke is made. And here we have a useful example. When the ball's on a steep slope and the player's concerned it might roll down the slope into a bush, that this rule will say that the player can't go in and just dig up the bush. The exception, though, is fairly far-reaching. There's no penalty under this rule if the player alters any of these other physical conditions to care for the course, such as by smoothing footprints in a bunker or placing a divot in a divot hole. So with that, keep it just as we saw in 8.1, as long as one of the reasons the player is taking these actions, such as raking a bunker, is to care for the course, this would apply. So let's look at interpretation 8.2b/1, which has, which is on page, let's see, bottom of page 121. So it has a couple of good examples. Examples of a player's actions that would breach Rule 8.2 if taken for the purpose of improving other physical conditions affecting their own play include when a player's ball is just short of the putting green, and although their line of play is straight at the hole, the player is concerned that their ball might come to rest in a nearby bunker. Before making the stroke, the player smooths sand in the bunker to make sure of a good lie if the shot to be played goes into the bunker. All right, now first question, if this bunker were on the player's line of play, would this be a Rule 8.2 issue? And the answer is no. It would then be simply a Rule 8.1 issue. So it's safe to say that this bunker is not on the player's line of play. But let's say the bunker is well to the right, and the player's concerned that because the green tilts sharply left to right, that the shot could get away from him and wind up there. Now, what would be the ruling if this player says, oh yeah, I'm going to go rake that bunker over there on the right, partly because I'm just a good guy. I like to keep the course in good shape, keep it in good shape for the groups behind, but also I want to rake it just in case my ball winds up there. In that case, would there be a breach? And the answer is no, there would not, because of that exception to Rule 8.2b. Because if the player does alter those physical conditions to care for the course, there would be no breach. So second example is player's ball lies at the top of a steep hill, and let's say it's a pretty thinly covered hill, and the player's concerned that the wind might blow the ball down the hill away from the hole before the player can play. And the player says, you know what, just in case that happens, I'm going to, tap down some of this tall grass at the bottom of the hill, so that in case it winds up there, I don't get too bad of a lie. So that would be a breach if the player does this. Now, does it matter if the ball never rolls down the hill? And it does not. It does not matter whether the ball actually winds up down the hill. As soon as the player does that, the player has breached this rule. And the penalty for that is the general penalty of loss of hole or 2 strokes. Next section, 8.3. Now we're going to talk about the player's deliberate actions to alter physical conditions to affect another player's play. So when does this rule apply? And we'll notice that this is not identical to 8.2. It's going to be a little bit different, because what is one thing that 8.2 does not include? And that does not include the conditions affecting stroke, just because Rule 8.1 already covers that. Well, 8.1 does not cover improving the conditions affecting the stroke for another player. So therefore 8.3 is going to have to cover that. So this rule applies, covers a player's deliberate actions to alter physical conditions to affect another player's ball at rest or stroke to be made by that other player. It does not apply to a player's actions to deliberately deflect or stop another ball in motion, or to alter any physical conditions to affect where that ball in motion might come to rest, because Rule 11 is going to cover that. Now, what the player is prohibited from doing. Player must not deliberately, so intent-based, take any of the actions listed in Rule 8.1a, such as moving, bending, or breaking anything growing or attached, to improve or worsen the conditions. So this applies either way, whether you're trying to be a good guy and improve something for another player, or you're being the opposite of a good guy and you're trying to worsen the conditions for somebody. So whether you're being good or bad, the player's not allowed to improve or worsen the conditions affecting the stroke, such as the line of play, area of intended swing, and so forth. Player is not allowed to alter any other physical conditions. So now conditions other than those affecting the stroke, where another player's ball might go or come to rest, or where that ball at rest might go or come to rest if it moves before the stroke is made. But this has the same exception for no penalty if the player alters any of these conditions to care for the course. Penalty for breach of this rule would be the general penalty. So any questions on Rule 8 there? There's a lot to go through, and it's worthwhile. We touched on just a couple of the clarifications there, but their clarifications are useful to go through because they provide good examples of the application of this rule.
Hey, John, this is Phil Paletti.
Yeah, Phil.
So in a situation where, I'll give you a couple different scenarios. So a player is taking relief from ground under repair, drops the ball, and the ball rolls out of the relief area into a bunker, and that bunker is on his line of play. So he goes and retrieves the ball from the bunker, rakes the bunker for the care of the course in retrieving the ball. He has violated 8.1 because 8.1 is an outcome-based rule, not an intent-based rule, and he can't unring the penalty bell because 8.1 says the only time you can improve your line of play with a bunker is when your ball has been played from the bunker and it comes to rest outside the bunker.
Yeah, Phil, you're exactly right. That would be a breach of Rule 8.1. And, while that seems a little bit of a harsh result because the player was doing something fairly innocent, retrieving his ball, but, we have to ask ourselves, is there anything the player could have done to protect himself so he didn't make those footprints in the bunker? And
Right.
the answer would be that, as Dan touched on under Rule 6, is the player could have just dropped another ball. He could have left the first ball in the bunker so as not to make any footprints to retrieve it, and then dropped another ball.
Right. So the special dispensation given to players for the caring for the course does not always apply. That permission does not trump prohibition in this particular case.
That's right. Under 8.1, the only time care of the course comes up is when the player was in the bunker and played out of the bunker. Otherwise, the player needs to be careful.
I have struggled with that situation forever, and Thank you for clarifying.
Well,
Yeah.
Phil, you have good reason, because before 2019, the answer is different. so I think that's part of the reason for the confusion.
Yeah, yeah. Okay, thank you. That helped.
Yep.
John, we do have a couple more online. I think we kind of answered it, but I just want to make sure this individual's question does get answered by you since you presented. It says, is it a breach of Rule 8.1A3 if the player puts divot mix back into a divot hole prior to taking stance and making a stroke?
Well, replacing the divot mix in the divot hole could be a breach depending on where that was. If that was in a spot where the player was going to take a stance, then that would be a breach. If that was on the player's line of play, then it could be somewhat subjective in that, if the player has a 150-yard shot from the fairway and he put some divot mix in a divot hole 5 yards in front of their ball, has a potential advantage been created? No. But if this happens just off the putting green when the player might putt the ball, then that would be a potential advantage. So it's going to depend as to the details as to where that divot hole was, but there's certainly the potential.
Okay, and then one more just clarification from online. If a player takes the least intrusive stance into a tree and breaks a branch or even the entire tree, there is no penalty as long as he doesn't exit the tree before making the stroke.
Well, yes and no. That if the player truly took the stance using the least intrusive course of action, and let's say something breaks, then as long as it truly was least intrusive, there's no penalty, regardless of whether the player stays in there and plays, or if the player comes back out and says, geez, I'm given that, I'm gonna change clubs or whatever, that's okay, as long as when the player did what he did, the player was fairly taking a stance, that's okay.
Okay, that's all the questions we have from here and online for Rule 8.
Okay, all right. Well, the Rule 8's a big one. So, as I said, I encourage everyone just to go back and look through the clarifications just to become more comfortable with the rule, because there's a lot there's a lot going on in it. All right, Rule 9 touches on the second key principle of the game of playing the ball as it lies. As we talk about in the purpose statement, if the player's ball comes to rest and is then moved by natural forces, the player will normally play the ball from its new spot. So when you hear the word normally, we know it's not going to be the case all the time, but the great majority of the cases it will be. If the ball at rest is lifted or moved by anyone or an outside agency before the stroke is made, the ball is going to be replaced. Sometimes there will be a penalty, sometimes there won't be a penalty, and therefore players should take care when they're near any ball at rest. So before we get into the rule, let's look at some important definitions here. We'll start with known or virtually certain, which is on page 339. And this is one that will come up, that we'll see in a number of rules. So it's good to know exactly what is meant. And known or virtually certain is the standard for deciding what happens to a player's ball. For example, did it come to rest in a penalty area? Did it move? And if it did move, what caused it to move? And known or virtually certain means it's more than just possible or even probable that incident happened. It means that either there is conclusive evidence, such as the player or someone else actually saw this happen, such as a spectator says, I saw your ball go into the pond right here. It splashed there and never bounced. That would be conclusive evidence. So that would be known. Also applies when, even though there's a small degree of doubt, all reasonably available information shows that it's at least 95% likely that the event in question happened. So continuing with the penalty area example, player hits his ball toward a penalty area, gets down there, doesn't find his ball. Nobody was down there to say whether it went in or out. But then the player looks around and realizes there really is nowhere else the ball could be. Because if the ball were not in the penalty area, it'd be on the firm, closely cut fairway. So from there, it's reasonable for the player to conclude that his ball is in fact in the penalty area. And the last paragraph of the definition is important, especially when it comes to Rule 9, which we'll cover. When searching for a ball, only information discovered within the 3-minute search time is considered when determining whether knowledge or virtual certainty exists. So we'll keep it in the context of Rule 9, which talks about a ball at rest that has been moved. So let's say, you hit your ball over a hill and you get down there and you can't find it. But you also saw a player in another group, leave that area. So in the back of your mind, there's a chance that this other player had played your ball. But then there's also some tall rough in the area. There's some bushes. So there's the question of, is it known or virtually certain that this other player, this outside influence, played and moved your ball? And, because of the presence of, let's say, the tall grass and the bushes, you're not going to have that 95% degree of certainty. So therefore, if it's the 3-minute mark, you don't have 95% likelihood, then it's not known or virtually certain. So let's say at that point, what do you have to do? Well, then you have to go back to the teen area, play another ball. Then let's say on your way back, so let's say at the 3:30 mark, the player from the other group rushes over and says, "Oh my gosh, were you playing a Titleist 2 with 3 orange dots? If so, I'm afraid I just played it from down there." Now, in that case, how is that player required to proceed? Well, as this sentence says, what you learn after that 3-minute mark doesn't matter. That since at the end of 3 minutes, it was not known or virtually certain that he had played your ball, you have to continue with a lost ball. So that's a tough result, but it's a necessary one to put a cap as to, as to what evidence you consider. Next definition that's an integral one to this rule is moved on page 345. When a ball at rest has left its original spot and has come to rest on any other spot, and this can be seen by the naked eye, the ball is considered to have moved. This applies whether the ball has gone up, down, or horizontally in any direction. So the direction of movement does not matter. So if a ball is perched up in tall grass and it sinks 1/2 inch, that ball has moved. Now, if the ball only wobbles or oscillates and it stays on the original spot, it has not moved. Next definition, natural forces. We'll see this can be one of 4 reasons that, 4 causes for a ball's movement. Natural forces are simply the effects of nature, such as wind and water, as well as when something happens for no apparent reason because of the effects of gravity. So let's say you hit your tee shot into the middle of the fairway. No one is anywhere near your ball. You're still 20 yards away, and you can see your ball move a yard. That would be an example of that ball having been moved by natural forces. And we'll see then we'll see soon how you would proceed. Last definition, outside influence, which is on page 352. An outside influence is any of these people or things that can affect what happens to a player's ball or equipment or to the course. So it's any person, including another player, except the player involved or that player's caddy or the player's partner or partner's caddy. Any animal, any natural or artificial object or anything else, and artificially propelled air and water. And that last one doesn't come up that often, but just shows that if you have a situation where a ball on a putting green is moved by the air from a fan that's been positioned around there during the summer, that even though we normally say wind is natural forces, that artificially propelled air would be considered an outside influence. And as we'll see in the rule, we'll wind up with very different results. So it makes a big difference whether that air is moved by, was considered natural force or an outside influence, similar to a ball being moved by, let's say, a stream of temporary water going down the fairway after a rainstorm, or a stream of water from a irrigation head. All right, so and one thing to keep in mind with this rule, a good way to approach any situation where you have a ball in play and at rest that has been moved is first to determine if the ball in fact did move, and then determine whether the ball must be replaced, and then determine whether there is a penalty. Because sometimes, as we'll see, a moved ball is going to be played from its new position, but in many cases, the majority of cases, the player is going to be required to replace the ball. And sometimes there will be a penalty, but often there will not be a penalty. So with that, let's jump into Rule 9.1a. Player's ball at rest on the course must be played as it lies, except when the rules require or allow the player either to play from somewhere else, such as a player taking relief from a cart path, or to lift the ball and replace it, such as on the putting green. 9.1b, what to do if the ball moves during the backswing or the stroke. So if the ball's movement begins only after the player's begun the stroke, which is the downswing or the backswing, and the player goes on to make the stroke, the ball must not be replaced, regardless of what caused it to move, and the player is going to play the ball from where it came to rest after that stroke. But this does not, all this is saying is that the player is not required or allowed to replace the ball. It is not saying that there's, and it's saying there's, we'll see later, there's no penalty for playing a moving ball in such a circumstance. But if the player had caused the ball to move, there could be a one-stroke penalty for having caused that ball to move. So the player's not necessarily off the hook. He's just off the hook for not needing to replace the ball and for playing a moving ball, but not off the hook for possibly having caused it to move. 9.2, now deciding whether the ball moved, and if so, what caused it to move. 9.2a, player's ball at rest is treated as having moved only if it's known or virtually certain that it did. So only if you have that 95% certainty. If the ball might have moved, but this is not known or virtually certain, then it's treated as not having moved and must be played as it lies. So strong evidence. So unless you're at least 95% certain that the ball did move, we're going to say the ball did not move, and therefore just go ahead and play the ball as it lies. Now, if it once it's determined that the ball did move, it must be decided what caused it to move, because that will determine whether the player has to replace that ball or play as it lies, and will also determine whether there is a penalty. And the rules recognize only 4 possible causes of movement. That is, first, natural forces. such as wind and water, the player's own actions, and that includes the player's caddy. In match play, the opponent's actions, or an outside influence. So if the ball did move, it moved for one of those 4 reasons. And this rule will tell us what to do in each of those 4 cases. Next section deals with the known or virtually certain standard for deciding what did in fact cause the ball to move. So if the player, opponent, or an outside influence is treated as having the cause to cause the ball to move only if it's known or virtually certain to be the cause. Now, if it is not known or virtually certain that at least one of those caused the ball to move, well, the default position is to treat the ball as having been moved by natural forces. So, and this is an important point, the most common point is, let's say a player calls you over and says, my ball moved, what do I do? Then as an official, you have what can be a somewhat tricky assignment then of determining whether the player's own actions caused that ball to move. So you then have to quiz the player as to what he did, which may have caused the ball to move. You know, for example, if he says, well, I took a practice swing hitting the ground right next to the ball, and then half a second later, the ball moved. Well, you know, I think it's fair to say that was cause and effect, and that the practice swing and the striking of the ground is what caused the ball to move. But if the player says, well, you know, I took some practice swings 10 feet over here, and then 20 seconds later, the ball moved, then because of the distance, because of the elapsed time, that connection is not as strong. So in that case, would you be 95% certain that the player's practice swings caused the ball to move? No, you would not be. So in that case, if the player didn't do anything else that could have caused the ball to move, the default position is to say, well, the ball moved by natural forces. And we'll see in this very next section what that means and what the player would do. And as we'll see, that's an important distinction because it determines both, one, where the player is going to make the next stroke from, and 2, whether the player gets a penalty stroke. All right, rule 9.3. If natural forces cause a player's ball to move, there's no penalty, and the ball must be played from its new spot. So in that example, if as a referee you determine, yep, natural forces cause the ball to move, no penalty, play the ball from its new spot, whether good or bad. There are a couple of exceptions though. Exception 1, ball on the putting green must be replaced if it moves after having already been lifted and replaced. So if the ball on the putting green has been lifted and replaced, and then it moves for any reason, even by natural forces, the ball must be replaced on its original spot. So let's go through 2 examples of this. First case, I hit my approach shot to the green. I can see the ball on the putting green. As I'm walking toward the green and no one is anywhere near the green, the ball moves. It moves, rolls, let's say 5 feet. Now, in that case, what am I going to do? I am going to play the ball from its new position without penalty. Now, second example, I hit my approach shot to the green. I walk up to the green. I mark, lift, and replace my ball. And then while I'm surveying my putt, the ball moves, let's say a foot. In that case, what's going to happen? Well, there's not going to be a penalty, but I am going to be required, because of exception 1 here, to replace the ball. You've probably heard some rules officials say that once you, on the putting green, once you lift and replace a ball, that ball owns that spot, meaning that even if wind blows it, the player will still play the ball from that position. So, so for players, especially on a windy day, it's a good idea to hurry up to the green and do that. All right, exception 2, and this is new for this year. Ball at rest must be replaced if it moves to another area of the course or out of bounds or after having been dropped, placed, or replaced. If the player puts the original ball or another ball into play by dropping, placing, or replacing, and natural forces cause the ball at rest to move, and it comes to rest in another area of the course or out of bounds, the ball must be replaced on its original spot. But for a putting green, look at exception 1. So in this case, several things have to happen for this exception to apply. 1, the player was putting a ball into play. Natural forces caused the ball to move, and the ball came to rest in another area of the course. So some of you may have seen what happened, I forget if it was last year or a few years ago, with Ricky Fowler at the Waste Management. He took relief from a red penalty area, dropped the ball, ball's at rest, but because it was on a steep slope, before he could play it, the ball rolled back into that penalty area. Now, the ruling at the time was that, well, your ball was at rest after you'd taken relief, so therefore, and then natural forces caused it to move, so you have to deal with wherever the natural forces moved your ball to. So at the time, the ruling was, either play it from the penalty area, or for another penalty stroke, take relief again from the penalty area. People thought that was too severe a result. Now we have this exception that will protect that player. So if the same incident were to happen, he would then replace the ball to where it was after he had originally taken relief. But notice this applies just when the ball rolls from one area of the course to another or to out of bounds. So the ball was in the general area, then it rolled into a penalty area. What happens if after the drop, Ricky's ball had rolled, let's say 20 yards backwards, but still in the general area? Would this exception have applied? And the answer is no, it would not have applied, since it was still in the same area of the course, the general area. All right, rule 9.4, ball lifted or moved by the player. This rule applies when it's known or virtually certain that the player, including his caddy, lifted his ball or the players or their actions caused it to move. So first, we'll determine whether the ball has to be replaced. The ball must be replaced on its original spot, except when the player lifts the ball under rule to take relief or to replace the ball somewhere else, or when the ball moves only after the player has begun the stroke or the backswing and the player goes on to make the stroke. So otherwise, except in those cases, if the player caused the ball to move, the player must replace the ball. As we'll go on to see, sometimes there's a penalty, sometimes there's not a penalty. But right now, we've just determined that the player caused the ball to move and that the ball must be replaced. So now let's see whether there is a penalty. If the player lifts or deliberately touches their ball at rest or causes it to move, the player gets 1 penalty stroke. And let's just pause for a second there, that even though this rule, really revolves around moving a ball, note that this section also applies to deliberately touching a ball. For example, if my ball is lying in pine straw, and I'm afraid that when I start moving pine straw, my ball might move. So I say, oh, I know what to do. I'm just going to stick my finger on my ball, hold it in place, and therefore that will ensure that it won't move. Well, I have deliberately touched my ball and would therefore get a penalty stroke. So in general, if the player lifts the ball when not allowed by the rules, deliberetty touches it or causes it to move, the player is going to get a penalty stroke. But there are 5 exceptions that have pretty wide applications. So let's go over those. 1, there's not going to be a penalty if the player was allowed to lift or move the ball. And this only makes sense that, if the player is allowed to lift the ball to take relief from a cart path, we're not going to penalize him for lifting the ball. If a player's ball has been moved and he's going to pick up that ball to replace it, we're not going to penalize him for that. Or if a rule requires or allows the player to drop or place a ball again, or to play a ball from a different place, such as taking relief from a penalty area, it's okay for the player to lift the ball in the first place. Exception 2, repeating what Dan covered under Rule 7, there's no penalty when the player accidentally causes the ball to move while he was trying to find or identify it. Exception 3, accidental movement on the putting green. There's no penalty when the player accidentally causes the ball to move on the putting green, no matter how that happens. So the 2 keys here, this applies only when the ball's on the putting green, and it applies only when the player accidentally causes the ball to move, such as he drops his putter on his ball, and that causes the ball to move. No penalty. If the player does something deliberate, such as he deliberately lifted his ball for some reason without having marked its position, well, he is going to get a penalty stroke for that. Exception 4 is accidental movement anywhere except on the putting green while applying the rule. So if the player is taking reasonable actions to mark the spot of the ball or lift or replace it, there's not going to be a penalty for causing the ball to move. If the player is removing a movable obstruction, no penalty. So for example, your ball's next to a bunker rake, you remove the bunker rake and that causes the ball to move, no penalty, but as we'll see under Rule 15, that you are going to be required to replace the ball. When the player is restoring worsened conditions, when allowed to do so, as we saw under Rule 8.1D, there's no penalty. For example, the player lifting his ball from the fringe because another player deposited sand on it. If the player is taking relief under rule, and is including determining whether relief is available, that could mean swinging a club to see if there's interference, or the player's trying to figure out where to take relief. For example, the player's trying to determine the nearest point of complete relief or is measuring on the ground. There's no penalty if the ball is moved in that process. And there's no penalty if the ball is moved in determining the order of play, such as on the putting green, especially in match play. Exception 5, there's no penalty if the ball moves after coming to rest against the player or equipment. So let's say a player's ball is on a slope, the player's several feet behind it, hasn't done anything to cause the ball to move. The ball moves on its own, and the ball rolls up against the player's foot. This just means that the player is allowed to remove his foot, even if that would cause the ball to move. There'd be no penalty, but the ball would still be replaced. And the penalty for playing a ball from a wrong place in breach of this rule is the general penalty. Now, let's think about how that can come up. We just talked about in 9.4b how in a lot of cases the player can get a one-stroke penalty. So how could he lose the whole match play or get 2 penalty strokes in stroke play? Well, that would kick in when the player does not do what the rule requires him to do, and that is replace the ball. So let's say in one of the in a situation covered by one of the exceptions where the player moved the ball and there's no penalty because of the exceptions, but the player was still required to replace the ball. If he did not replace it and instead played from its new position, he has played from the wrong place and would be penalized under the wrong place rule, 14.7a. But then let's go on and read that final paragraph. If a player is required to replace a moved ball under this rule, but fails to do so and plays from the wrong place, the player would get only the general penalty under Rule 14.7a. So let's say a player does something. Let's say he is walking down the fairway and he is not paying attention to where he's walking, and he accidentally kicks and moves his ball in play in the fairway. So that would be a 1-stroke penalty, and he's required to replace the ball. But if he does not replace the ball and plays the ball from where it wound up after he kicked it, in match play, he'll lose the hole, and in stroke play, he will get a total penalty of 2 strokes. He would not get 3 penalty strokes, just a total penalty of 2 strokes. All right, changing gears, rule 9.5, dealing with match play. What happens if your opponent lifts or moves your ball? And we say at the start that if the opponent plays your ball as a wrong ball, well, that's covered by rule 6.3c, which Dan just covered. And in most cases in match play, that will make the question moot as to how you proceed, because if your opponent plays a wrong ball, he's going to lose the hole, and that makes things nice and simple. So 9.5a, if the opponent lifts or moves the player's ball at rest, the ball must be replaced on the original spot. Times where it does not have to be replaced would be if the opponent is conceding the next stroke, such as, Jeff hits a putt up near the hole and I just pick up that ball and toss it back to him. He's not going to be required to replace it. Or if the opponent lifts or moves the ball at the player's request because the player intends to apply a rule to take relief or to replace the ball somewhere else. So if I ask Jeff, say, to lift my ball on a cart that's lying on a cart path because I'm going to take relief from that cart path, obviously that ball is not going to be required to be replaced. Now let's see when there would be a penalty for the opponent moving the player's ball. And again, keep in mind this is only in match play. If the opponent lifts, deliberately touches, or causes the player's ball to move, the opponent gets 1 penalty stroke. But not surprisingly, we have a few exceptions here. Exception 1 is the opponent was allowed to lift the player's ball. So there's no penalty to lift the ball when conceding or at the player's request, as we covered in the previous section. Exception 2 is very specific, is when the opponent marks and lifts the player's ball on the putting green in the mistaken belief that it's his own ball. So let's say Dan and I are playing together. We hit our approach shots up to an elevated green. We get up to the putting green, and I walk over to a ball which I think is mine, and I mark and lift it, and then I say, whoops, this is actually Dan's ball. That in that particular case, there is no penalty. Exception 3, same exceptions as for the player. So as we saw under Rule 9.4b, those same exceptions would apply. So, and that includes accidental movement. So let's say I'm on the putting green and I accidentally drop my putter, which strikes and which lands on Dan's ball and moves it. Since that was accidental movement on the putting green, no penalty to either player, and the ball would be replaced. All right, Rule 9.6, ball lifted or moved by an outside influence. If it's known or virtually certain that an outside influence lifted or moved a player's ball at rest, there's no penalty, and the ball must be replaced. And this applies whether or not the ball has been found. So, for example, if I hit my tee shot into the fairway and I see a dog run out, pick up my ball in his mouth and run across the fairway, that even though I am not physically getting that ball back, it is known or virtually certain what happened. And that is that an outside influence, the dog, moved my ball in play and at rest, and therefore I have to replace it. But, and this is a big but, if it's not known or virtually certain that the ball was lifted or moved by an outside influence and the ball is lost, the player must take stroke and distance relief under Rule 18.2. So similar to the situation where, let's say, hit my ball over a hill and then I see a dog run away, but I don't see a ball in the dog's mouth. We look for 3 minutes, can't find my ball. But it's not known or virtually certain. We don't have that 95% degree of certainty that the dog, in fact, picked up my ball, because there's also tall grass in the area, then I'm going to have to proceed under stroke and distance. So that's why it's such a big point to determine whether there is knowledge or virtual certainty that the ball was, in fact, moved by an outside influence. Rule 9.7, and just one point before we leave here, that there is, just to appreciate the difference between having an opponent in match play move your ball, which in some cases, as we saw, can be a penalty, versus another player in your group in stroke play who moves your ball, and there would not be a penalty because that player is an outside influence. So it could be the same act, but because of the form of play, could wind up with different results. 9.7 talks about the ball marker. So far, this rule has spoken to just the ball itself. Now, for completeness, we'll address the ball marker. And this rule will basically treat the ball marker the same as the ball itself. 9.7a, if it's known or virtually certain that the player's ball marker is lifted or moved, including by natural forces, before the ball is replaced, the player must either replace the ball on its original spot or put a ball marker down on that original spot. And if the player doesn't know for certain where that was, the player will estimate. So the player could just go ahead and put the ball itself back down, or he could estimate where the ball marker was, put another ball marker there, and then replace the ball. 9.7b, if the player or their opponent match play lifts the player's ball marker or causes it to move, the player or opponent gets one penalty stroke. But there are exceptions about lifting or causing the ball marker to move. So in any of the cases where there's no penalty for lifting, there's also no penalty for lifting the ball. There's also no penalty for lifting or moving the player's ball marker. So the classic example of this is, let's say that Thomas and I are playing a match. I hold a long putt I'm very excited about, and I think that has just caused me to win the hole. So I go over and lift Thomas's ball marker, thinking he's out of the hole. And he says, John, what are you doing? I have that to tie you, or possibly to beat me. Well, then what happens? I'm going to get a penalty stroke in that case, aren't I? Because that was not accidental movement on the putting green. That was deliberate movement. So that would be a penalty stroke for me. And now Thomas, might tie or win the hole. All right, so that is Rule 9. Again, common themes: determine if the ball moved, determine if the ball needs to be replaced, and then determine if there is a penalty. Any questions on Rule 9?
John, Dan has one from the room here.
Okay.
John, question on 9.2B, parent 2. A player and opponent are walking down the middle of the fairway, talking to each other, not paying attention, and they swing their feet and they accidentally kick the ball and it moves. They look at each other and they have no idea which player kicked the ball, but they know to 100% certainty that one of them. Is that a natural causes, or is that something else?
Right, so you're saying that so it's clear that either the player or the opponent caused the ball to move, and they're just not sure which of the two it is?
Correct.
Okay, and I think that's going to be one case where it's, a question of, do you resolve doubt in favor of the player or against the player? And I suppose my instinct, and I can't point to anything in the book that supports this, but my instinct would be to resolve it against the player and say that the player caused the ball to move, because in that case.
So even though we have no idea who caused it, we're going to assume that it's 95% likely that the player did?
Yeah, I think in that case, it has to go one way or the other. And I think it would my inclination would be to rule against the player in that case. But as I said, I can't point to a clarification that supports that. I know there is, was it under 16, the clarification talks about, well, your ball's either in temporary water or it's in a penalty area, and it gives the player, I believe, kind of the worst result. That might be the closest we can get, because the intent of that is not to say that, oh no, natural forces caused it to move. All right, anything else on Rule 9?
John, we do have two that just came in. And one, the first one kind of goes with Rule 9, and then we'll probably get into it in 14, but since we do kind of cross-reference a couple of times here between the two, the ball is a player who's dropping a ball and is rolling towards his foot. Is the player obligated to move? If he doesn't move and the ball comes to rest against his foot, is there a penalty for that action?
Yeah, I think I mean, it's a good question, and the question is, has the player deliberately, deflected the drop ball? Answers no, because his foot was there to begin with, presumably not for that purpose. And I think it's better we just, so we don't get sidetracked, we just talk with that under Rule 14, which is next week.
And then one last one from online. Competitor slaps back a putt of a fellow competitor's ball that is overhanging the hole before the 10 seconds is up. Penalty on fellow competitor.
Okay, in that case, that's a specific area we'll get to actually next week under Rule 13.3. Just with the ball overhanging the hole has its own kind of special treatment, and let's just talk about that next week under that rule. But let's please help me to remember that.
Yep. All right, that's all the questions we have for 9.
Okay.
John, I think we can, if you're comfortable, I think we can just keep moving.
Let's keep moving on with Rule 10 for our final rule of the day. But unfortunately, a pretty big rule with a lot going on in it. This rule has to do really with playing the game, with making strokes, with negotiating your way around the golf course, asking for advice, receiving help, and having a caddy. So let's start with a few definitions. First, definition of advice on page 326. Advice is any verbal comment or action that is intended to influence a player. And that's an important point not to gloss over. That definition is intent-based. So advice has to carry with it the intent to influence a player in choosing a club, in making a stroke, or in deciding how to play during a hole or a round. But it does not include public information, which includes things such as location of items on the course, distance from one point to another. And then this is a new item, wind direction, or the rules. So with wind direction, if Jeff and I are playing together and I ask Jeff, say, Jeff, I can't tell, is the wind into us or is it left to right? And if Jeff says it's left to right, that is okay. That is now okay to ask. Next definition is caddy on page 330. Caddy is someone who helps a player during the round, including in these ways. By carrying, transporting, or handling the player's clubs, or giving advice, because a caddy's the only person a player may ask for advice from during the round. And the caddy may also help the player in other ways, which we'll see later in this rule. So the purpose of Rule 10 covers how to prepare for and make a stroke, including advice and other help that the player may get from others. And the underlying principle is that golf is a game of skill and personal challenge. Yeah, again, that's an important principle. We saw something similar when Dan covered Rule 4 last week, that, part of the purpose of the rules is to make sure that the amount of skill involved remains relevant and important, because that is the whole point of competitive golf, is to see who is more skilled, both physically and mentally. Rule 10.1, making a stroke. This covers how to make a stroke. It's saying a stroke is made by fairly striking a ball with the head of the club, and the fundamental challenge is to direct and control the movement of the entire club by freely swinging the club without anchoring it. So when you read, okay, that's the purpose, then it makes sense why there's a prohibition against anchoring the club, because the purpose is for the club to have the club be swung freely during a stroke. Rule 10.1a, fairly striking the ball. In making a stroke, the player must fairly strike at the ball with any part of the head of the club. So that means, for example, a player could use the toe of his club or the back of the club head, but as long as there's only momentary contact between the club and the ball must not be pushed, scraped, or scooped. So momentary contact is an important point when you know that the ball was fairly struck at. If the player's club accidentally hits the ball more than once, there has been only one stroke and there's no penalty. So if a player double hits a chip shot, the player will count just the original stroke made and no penalty for that second contact, and will play the ball from wherever it winds up. Rule 10.1b, anchoring the club. In making a stroke, the player must not anchor the club by either of these two methods. First, directly by holding the club or a gripping hand against any part of the body, except the player may hold the club or a gripping hand against a forearm, as we see some players do with a longer shaft going up their left forearm, and then the right hand gripping that shaft against that forearm. That is okay. Or a player must not anchor the club indirectly through use of an anchor point by holding a forearm against any part of the body to use a gripping hand as a stable point around which the other hand may swing the club. And there's a clarification, 10.1b/1, which is on page 147, that helps explain and illustrate that provision. And that says that holding a forearm against the body during the stroke is an indirect means of anchoring the club. But for an anchor point to exist, two things have to happen. So both of these have to happen. The player must hold a forearm against the body, and the player must grip the club so that the hands are separated and work independently from each other. So this was the old way a lot of players would use the long putter. They would have their forearm against them, sometimes with a hand against the chest, sometimes not, but the forearm anchored against the chest. Then the hands would be separated, one hand near the top, the other hand well below, to try to get that pendulum stroke. And that would not be permissible. But notice at the end of the clarification, it says a player is allowed to hold one or both forearms against their body in making the stroke, so long as this does not create an anchor point. So you see the old, on Golf Channel, the old films from the 1960s of players with the wristier strokes where it looks like they might have, a forearm anchored against, say, their left thigh. That is okay as long as they don't create an anchor point. I mean, among other things, if both of their hands are together, that would be okay. Rule goes on to say, if the player's club, gripping hand, or forearm merely touches their body or clothing during the stroke without actually being held, there's no breach, so any incidental touching is okay. And forearm means the part of the arm below the elbow joint and includes the wrist. Then we have helpful illustrations of methods of stroke that are and are not okay. Top left, we see that player has a longer putter that extends up his left forearm, and that's okay. Bottom left, neither the forearm nor the gripping hand is touching the body. So even though the hands are separated, an anchor point has not been created. So if your nerves are good enough to do that, you're allowed to do that. Top right, the club is anchored against the stomach. That is not permissible. Bottom right, forearm or the gripping hand is against the chest, and neither one of those would be permissible. Rule 10.1c. Player must not make a stroke from a stance with a foot deliberately placed on each side of or with either foot deliberately touching the line of play or an extension of that line behind the ball. For this rule only, the line of play does not include a reasonable distance on either side. So notice this rule talks about deliberately taking such a stance, from putting, say, croquet style between your legs. And the exception is important to note that there's no penalty if such a stance is taken accidentally, players not even intending to do that, or even if the player intentionally takes such a stance for the purpose of avoiding a player's line of play. So player, let's say in stroke play, just has a short putt to tap in, and he's conscious of another player's line of putt, and he takes a stance with 1 foot behind the ball to tap in the 6-incher. As long as he took that stance to avoid standing in the other player's line, that's okay. There's no breach. Rule 10.1b, playing a moving ball. Player, we've alluded to this a little bit before, player must not make a stroke at a moving ball. And when is a ball moving? Well, when it's not at rest on a specific spot. Now, if a ball has come to rest and is wobbling or oscillating, then it's treated as being at rest and is not a moving ball. And that's important to note, because that means if you play a ball that's oscillating, there's no penalty because you have not played a moving ball. But there are exceptions as to when there is no penalty for playing a moving ball. One, as we touched on under Rule 9, if the ball begins to move during the backswing or the stroke, and the player goes ahead and plays, there is no penalty for playing a moving ball. Dan covered ball falling off the tee. There's no penalty for playing a moving ball in such a situation. And then if a ball is moving in temporary water or in water in a penalty area, the player may make a stroke at the moving ball, or the player may take relief and lift the moving ball. As ordinarily you're not allowed to lift a moving ball, but this gives the player that authority. In either case, though, the player is not allowed to delay play unreasonably for the purpose of allowing the wind or water current to move the ball to a better place. So if the player looks at his ball in this stream, whether it's of temporary water coming down the fairway or in a creek to the side of the hole, and says, I bet in 30 seconds that ball is going to wind up in a very nice spot, he can't delay playing to let that ball move to that better spot. Now, in all of these situations where the player incurs the general penalty under this rule, could be for making a stroke that's with the club is anchored, could be for playing a moving ball. If the player incurs the general penalty, in match play, we know it's going to be simple. The player is simply going to lose the hole. But in stroke play, we still need to come up with a score for the player. So we would the player would get 2 penalty strokes. And then this is important, that the stroke that was made in breach of this rule, for example, the anchored stroke, would count in the player's score. So even though it's not an appropriate stroke, it still counts as a stroke, and the player would get the 2 penalty strokes in stroke play on top of that. All right, next rule, 10.2, advice and other help. Going back to the fundamental that it's a challenge for the player to decide the strategy and tactics for their play. So therefore, there are limits as to what advice and help the player may receive during the round. Start with advice. Notice this applies during the round, but certainly a player is allowed to receive advice before the round, as well as when play has been stopped. For example, because of lightning. Player must not give advice to anyone in the competition playing the course, or ask for advice other than from the player's caddy, or touch another player's equipment to learn information that would be advice if given by or asked by that other player. So a classic example of that is if Jeff and I are playing together on par 3 tee, I walk over to Jeff's bag to see, through process of elimination, what club he must be playing. If I just look, that's okay. But if Jeff is a very competitive person, or he's on to me and has covered his clubs with his towel, and I go over and remove that towel, so then I can see which club is missing and which club he's using, then I would be considered to have to be in breach of this rule. And the penalty for breach is the general penalty. Now we have a new section that helps us determine where to apply the penalty if the penalty happens between holes. And as we'll see, it determines whether the two players involved have both finished the hole, or if one of them is still playing that hole. So if a player asks for or gives advice when either player is playing a hole, then the player gets the general penalty on the hole being played or just completed. So for example, Drew and I are playing together in stroke play, and on the 7th hole, I hole out. And Drew then asked me for help reading his putt that he has remaining. And I go and help him read the putt, and I say, looks like it's a ball outside the right. Then in that case, what will happen? Drew is going to get 2 penalty strokes for asking me for advice, and that will be on the hole being played. And I'm going to get 2 penalty strokes for giving him advice. And because he was playing that hole, my 2-stroke penalty would apply to that hole. So if this was on the 7th green, I will add 2 penalty strokes to my score for hole number 7, even though I had already holed out on that hole. Next part is if a player asks for or gives advice when both players are between the play of 2 holes. So let's say Drew and I have both finished hole number 7. And while walking to number 8, I say, Drew, do you have any idea why I'm missing it left off every tee? And he says, John, I think you're lined up too far closed. Then in that case, in stroke play, we would both get a 2-stroke penalty on that next hole, on the 8th hole, because we are both between holes in that point. All right, rule 10.2b, other help. Getting help from the caddy with the line of play is the first section, is dealing with when the caddy is helping you out. So when the player's caddy is helping the player with the line of play or other directional information, the caddy is subject to the following limitations. And some of this is going to be new for this year. The caddy must not set an object down to provide such help, and the player can't avoid penalty by removing that. So for example, if the caddy can't go to the top of the hill, put his hat down, walk back and say, boss, aim at my hat. As soon as the caddy sets that hat down, there is a breach. And then while the stroke is being made, the caddy must not stand in a position for the player to play towards. So the caddy can't stand on top of the hill saying, aim at me, and remain there during the stroke. Player and the caddy must not do anything else to provide such help, such as point out a spot on the ground. And we'll see later, the caddy must not stand in the restricted area when not allowed, once the player has started to take a stance. But this rule does not prohibit the caddy from attending the flagstick and standing near it while doing so. All right, next talks about getting help from any other person. So it could be a spectator, it could be a volunteer, it could be another player, with getting help with the line of play or other directional information. So first, in general, the player must not get help with line of play or other directional information from anyone else, except as follows. That is, that person may provide help by giving public information in relation to an object, saying, yep, that tree, that big oak tree in the distance lines up with the center line of the fairway. That's fine. And then other than when the player's ball is on the putting green, that person may stand in a position for the player to play towards, but must move away before the stroke is made. So, if Jeff and I are playing together and I have a blind shot, I say, Jeff, will you please go up there and give me the line to the hole? He goes up to the top of the hill, stands there and says, John, right here. But then we need to make sure that he steps away before I actually play. Next section, no setting down an object to help with aiming, taking a stance, or swinging. The player must not set down an object to help with aiming or to help in taking a stance for the stroke to be made. For example, a player is not allowed to place a club along his toes to help with alignment. And what does set an object down mean? It means the object's in contact with the ground and the player is not touching the object. So the player has let go of the object. If the player breaches this rule, the player cannot avoid penalty by removing the object before the stroke is made. So you can't put the club down and then pick it up, because let's face it, once you've picked it up, you've already benefited from it. So it makes sense that the player cannot avoid penalty. And this rule also applies to an action taken for a similar purpose, such as putting a mark in sand or dew to help with your swing. So if you're being smart, if you think you're being clever and you're playing first thing in the morning with dew on the ground, you can't draw a line where you want your feet to go. That would be considered the same. It would be a breach of this rule. Now, one point with this, just to make everyone aware, is I think we have at least one player who uses the stand-up putter, is that one of the two clarifications on the USGA website currently deals with the self-standing putter, saying that the implementation of certain uses of that has been delayed and will not take effect for 2 years, for January 1st, 2025. So just take a look on the USGA website or on the app and be aware of that, because I believe we have at least one pretty good player who likes to use that type of putter. And among other things, let's make sure that he is aware of that. All right, fourth section, restricted area for caddy before the player makes a stroke. This was a big change for 2019, and the rule itself now basically includes what the clarifications issued in 2019 include. When a player begins taking a stance, meaning at least 1 foot in position, and until the stroke is made, there are limitations relating to when and why the player's caddy may deliberately stand on or close to an extension of line of play behind the ball, the so-called restricted area. The caddy must not stand in the restricted area to help the player with aiming. This includes when the caddy moves away without seeing anything, but by doing so is giving a signal to the player they're correctly aimed. And this is helpful both to players and to officials. There is no penalty if the player backs away before making a stroke, the caddy moves away, then the player begins again. So let's say, for example, that Jeff and I are playing together, or that Jeff is playing, I'm Jeff's caddy. Jeff takes a stance and I'm standing right behind him on extension of line of play. And I say, yep, Jeff, that looks good. But then Thomas, a referee, says, whoa, 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 guys, what are you doing? You're not allowed to do that. This provision allows Thomas to say, hey, John, why don't let's both of you back away. Jeff, back away from the ball. John, you get out of there. And then Jeff, take your stance, starting afresh. Then in that situation, there would be no penalty. And so that's useful to know, because that can help us as officials help players prevent or avoid penalties. Next part, help other than aiming. If the caddy is helping the player with something specific other than aiming, such as checking to see if the club will strike a nearby tree branch during the backswing, caddy may stand in the restricted area, but only if the caddy moves away before the stroke is made, and provided his positioning is not part of a regular routine. So in other words, if the caddy is back there, not to help with aiming, but just to say, you know what, I think you're clear. Take your regular swing. You're not going to hit this branch. Or to say, hey, you know, maybe your backswing needs to be a hair flatter than usual to miss this branch. That would be okay as long as the caddy moves before the stroke. Goes on to say there's no penalty if the caddy is inadvertently standing in the restricted area, such as if the caddy is standing behind the player, but the caddy is not aware of his relative position to the player. Because let's say the caddy is preoccupied studying a scoreboard, for example, and simply not aware of where he is in relation to the player. This rule does not prohibit the player from getting help by having someone else stand in the restricted area to help track the flight of a ball. So if Jeff and I are playing together and we're playing into the setting sun, and I say, Jeff, my eyes aren't very good. Will you mind helping me follow this? And he says, sure. Then he could stand behind me on an extension of the line of play during the stroke, since he's standing there for that purpose. All right, next section 5. Physical help, eliminating distractions and protection from the elements. Player must not make a stroke while getting physical help from their caddy or any other person. So from anybody, so actual physical help, or with their caddy or any other person deliberately positioned to eliminate distractions, you know, or give protection from sunlight, rain, wind, or other elements. So, for example, a player couldn't tell his caddy, hey, could you stand exactly there so that the sun's not in my eyes when I play? Can't do that during the stroke. But notice that this rule does not prohibit the player from taking their own actions to protect against the elements, you know, such as holding an umbrella over their own head while they tap in a short putt. And it does not prohibit a player from asking another person who is not deliberately positioned to remain in position or to move out of the way. And sometimes you'll see, you know, especially say around teen areas where space is a little tight, where the player's caddy will ask a spectator, do not move. Because that person's, let's say, body is right on the player's ball or is near it, and if the spectator moved, that could distract the player. Or the caddy might say, hey, you know, you please move out of the way, just to make sure that, you know, if you do move, it just doesn't distract the player. All right, so speaking of caddies, on to rule 10.3. Purpose of this rule, you know, it's okay to have a caddy carry the player's clubs, give advice, and offer help. And this is, you know, the dynamic and the relationship between the player and the caddy are an interesting part of the game, because, you know, we tend to think of golf as an individual sport, but this adds a certain aspect of teamwork to it. But the rules are going to limit what the caddy is allowed to do. And we talked about last week, the player is responsible for the caddy's actions during the round, but not before the round. And the player will get a penalty if the caddy breaches the rules during the round. So 10.3a, players allowed only one caddy at a time. The player must not have more than one caddy at any one time. The player is allowed to change caddies during the round, but must not do so temporarily for the sole purpose of getting advice from the new caddy. It's certainly safe to say that in many cases when the player wants to change caddies, he's doing so because he wants better advice. But what this provision prohibits is something like, let's say a top player is struggling the final round of the US Open, and let's say Butch Harmon is his swing coach, and he asks, and he quote unquote fires his caddy for half a hole so that Butch can come out, put on the bib, carry his bag, and in a few minutes tell him why he can't hit a fairway. That if the player were to do so, he would be in breach of this rule. But and then another part is important, and we'll look at a clarification here. Whether or not the player has a caddy, any other person who walks or rides with the player or who carries other things for the player, such as rain suit or lunch or a snack, is not the player's caddy unless they are named as such by the player or also carries, transports, or handles the player's clubs. So common example, at a junior event, if a player's parent is carrying the player's rain suit and let's say a sandwich, that's okay. That person is not considered to be the player's caddy. And that would be important in case one, the terms of the condition do not allow the players to have a caddy, or two, if the player does have a caddy already. Now, the other point that can come up in some events is, let's look at clarification 10.3a/1 on page 150. That in the second paragraph, we talk about when you have a golf cart and a player has someone ride in the cart or even drive the cart. Well, if the player is riding in the cart and driving the cart, and let's say the player has a friend or family member riding in the cart, no problem. That other person is not automatically a caddy, but does need to be careful not to do caddy-like things, such as needs to be careful not to give advice. But if that other person drives the cart, then that person would be considered the player's caddy, since they are also transporting the player's clubs. So again, that would be an issue if, let's say, the player already had a caddy who's walking, carrying the player's bag, or just has the caddy who's perhaps riding the cart, sometimes walks, then this family member sometimes drives the cart and thereby transports the player's bag. So that person would be the player's caddy. And it's worth keeping in mind that, even in a case where, let's say, the player does not have another caddy, but this driver would be the player's caddy, it's worthwhile to point out to the player that consequence, just because the player could be penalized if this person as the caddy does certain things, such as causes the ball to move. So just something to be aware of. All right, back to the rule 10.3a2. 2 or more players may share a caddy. I often see that, not at the competitive level so much, but certainly at the recreational level. And when there is a rules issue involving a specific action of a shared caddy, and it needs to be decided which player the action was taken for, here's the guidance to determine whose caddy whose player that caddy is considered to be. First, if the caddy's action was taken at the specific direction of one of the players sharing the caddy, the action was taken for that player. So if Jeff and I are sharing a caddy and I tell the caddy, go rake that bunker, then it's understood that while raking the bunker, that caddy is my caddy in case something comes up. But if neither of us specifically directed the action is treated as taken for the player sharing the caddy whose ball is involved. So in other words, Jeff and I haven't said anything to our caddy. Our caddy's walking down the fairway and accidentally hits and moves my ball. Then he's considered to be my caddy. And as we saw under Rule 9.4, that's going to be a one-stroke penalty for me, and then the ball must be replaced. Then lastly, if neither of the players sharing the caddy specifically directed the caddy's actions and neither of our balls were involved, all players sharing the caddy get the penalty. So let's say a situation where Jeff and I are sharing a caddy, and our caddy on his own goes over and talks and gives unsolicited advice to another player. Then in that case, both Jeff and I are going to be penalized. So a pretty harsh result, and shows how important it is to have people as caddies who know what they're doing. That's always a little nervy when you have inexperienced people, possibly even non-golfers, serving as caddies. They can put their players in a bad spot. So the penalty for breach of this rule is the general penalty for each hole during which they're helped by more than one caddy. And if this breach happens between two holes, the penalty applies to the next hole. Now, one thing that's worth noting is there is no maximum penalty. So if a player plays 9 holes with 2 caddies, in stroke play, that player is going to wind up with 18 penalty strokes. So that's a lot. All right, next section, what a caddy may do. Examples of what a caddy is allowed and not allowed to do. Actions that are always allowed. Carry, transport, and handle the player's clubs. Search for the player's ball. Give information, advice, and other help. Smooth bunkers. And take other actions to care for the course. Remove sand and loose soil and repair damage on the putting green. Remove or attend the flagstick. Lift the player's ball, but this is qualified only once it's reasonable to conclude that the player will take relief under a rule. Such as, so for example, if I am caddying for Drew and Drew hits his tee shot onto a cart path, I get down there first and I lift the ball because to myself, I say, I know Drew is going to want to take relief from the cart path. That is not permissible. It's only once it's clear that Drew has already indicated that he's going to take relief from the cart path, then I could lift the ball for him. Next, mark the spot of the ball and lift and replace the ball, but only on the putting green. Only on the putting green. So if I'm caddying for Drew, he hits his approach shot up to the putting green, and I get up there first, even without his specific authority, I can go ahead, mark, lift, clean his ball for him, which is good, and that only helps speed up play. Likewise, I'm certainly allowed to clean the ball, when it's in a position when it can be cleaned, and I'm allowed to remove loose impediments and movable obstructions. Now, actions I'm allowed to take only with the player's specific authorization, and this must be given on a case-by-case basis and not generally for the round. So for example, on the first tee, if Drew says, John, anytime I have interference from an immovable obstruction, you have my authority to go ahead and lift the ball. Can't do that. It has to be on a case-by-case basis. So when authorized by the player, the caddy is allowed to restore conditions that were worsened after the player's ball came to rest, or when the player's ball is anywhere except on the putting green, lift the player's ball under rule requiring it to be replaced, such as the cart path example. Now, a caddy is not allowed to take these actions for the player. Concede the next stroke, hole, or match, because that's something that obviously only the player himself wants to be able to do. Replace a ball unless the caddy had lifted or moved the ball, and we'll see next week in Rule 14 how that works. Drop or place a ball. Again, we'll see next week more detail. And decide to take relief, such as, if a player's ball is in a bush, the caddy on his own can't say, oh yeah, my player's going to take relief from this. And the caddy can say, hey boss, I think that would be a good idea, to go the unplayable route, but ultimately it needs to be the player's decision. And then Rule 10.3C, player is responsible for the caddy's actions and a breach of the rules. So a player is responsible for the actions during the round and while play is stopped, but as we said, not before or after a round. If the action breaches a rule or would breach a rule, if the player himself had taken that action, then the player is going to get that penalty, because it will be treated as if the player himself had done that. And when an application of a rule depends on whether the player is aware of certain facts, the player's knowledge is treated as including whatever is known by their caddy. So, for example, if a player hits a tee shot near a boundary, gets up there, finds the ball just in bounds, says, "Oh, thank goodness," and goes ahead and plays. But the caddy, meanwhile, had known all along that the ball had come to rest out of bounds and that a homeowner had thrown it back in bounds, then the player is going to be in trouble, because the player is going to be treated as having known that that ball had been out of bounds with that. All right, so that is Rule 10. Several different aspects, but all dealing with playing the game, how to make a stroke and how to kind of strategize your way around the golf course. Any questions on Rule 10?
Yeah, John, just one from the online portion.
Okay.
John, a question online asks, how do we define the restricted area for caddies? What does stand on or close to an extension of line of play mean? Within 3, 4, or 5 feet? Just looking for advice on applying this rule.
Okay, well, it's a type of thing that, certainly over the years, in recent years, the USGA and the RNA have done a very good job in making the rules more definite in certain ways, such as saying knowledge or virtual certainty involves 95% certainty. And, the fact that they did not do something like this here, I think is a deliberate move, to allow judgment from each committee as to what's considered to be on or close to. And I think one way to look at it is to say, is the caddy close enough to be in a position to be of assistance? And that if, if the caddy is, just a foot or two off the extension of the line of play, the caddy is going to be close enough where he could help the player. But if the caddy is, say, several paces away, then from that angle, the caddy is really not going to be in a position to help the player. So I think that's, one criterion that can be applied in determining what is close, is to say, is it close enough that it could be of any use. So, I'm sorry, there's not a specific distance, but I think that is intentional to allow a judgment in each case, taking into account all the circumstances.
We've got one question from in the room here.
John, could a caddy go out and play the golf course between rounds of a tournament?
Okay, could a caddy go out and play the course between rounds of a tournament? Answer to that is yes. While, in some cases the player himself might not be able to, remember that the player is responsible for the caddy's actions only during the round and while play is stopped during that round. But before and after the round, it's fair game. And one way to look at it is, we don't know for sure until the player steps on the first tee for his next round who his caddy is going to be for that round even. So I think that's one reason, that the player is not responsible for the players, for the caddy's actions. But certainly, each committee might have, some conditions in place that might prohibit that. For example, I believe that some of the professional tours don't allow caddies to walk onto putting greens between rounds. That sometimes caddies like to scout out that day's hole locations, but I believe some tours say they can't go onto the green when doing so. So that could be a similar term of condition.
That's all the questions that we have.
Okay, all right. Well, thanks, everybody. I know we covered a lot of material today, including some pretty dense stuff, especially in rules 6, 8, and 10. So thank you for your patience and bearing with us. And next week, let's see, Jeff, I believe, is it next Thursday we're scheduled?
Correct, yeah, and we'll be sending out an email to everybody just as we've done the past 2 weeks, and look forward to being with everybody next week.
All right, very good. Well, thanks, everybody. And next week, we'll cover rules 11 through 14, just so you know, in case you want to take a look beforehand.
All right, thank you, John. Thank you, Dan.
Thank you guys.
All right, bye, everybody.